Every battle is both a victory and a defeat. It depends which flag you fly. In every theatre of the Second World War, battles won and lost determined possession of territory, of resources, and of the strength to go on fighting. For some of the battles, it was the victory that most influenced the future course of the war. For others, it was the defeat. This is the story of the battles won and lost that decided the outcome of the greatest conflict in history. Every war sees new tactics, some inspired, some desperate, that try to influence the course of battles. In the Second World War, campaigns were waged against non-military targets in an attempt to destroy morale. Suicide missions were launched when traditional weapons failed, and forces withdrew rather than fire on their fellow countrymen. These are the battles, won and lost, that rewrote the rules of engagement. An archipelago of almost 1,000 islands, Solomon Islands is critically positioned off the northeastern Cape of Australia. The Japanese called the main island Gadaru Kararu. The Americans called it Cactus. Its name is Guadalcanal. Japanese troops landed there in April 1942 as part of their sweep through the Western Pacific.
The Allies were shifting from a defensive mode into an offensive mode. They hadn't yet done it. They were still short on resources. There was a great argument going on in the halls of power about Europe being the dominant theatre of war and the Pacific being the secondary theatre of war. So there was always a fight over who got what resources. But the mentality was changing. The attack on Guadalcanal was the first of these offensive moves.
Japanese bases in the captured Solomon Islands threaten the whole Allied position northeast of Australia. Their recapture marks the beginning of the second phase in the Pacific.
Following the naval victory at Midway, the American Chiefs of Staff devised a three-phase campaign to wrest control back from the Japanese. Admiral Nimitz would lead the offensive to recapture Tulagi and Guadalcanal. General MacArthur's objective would be Lae before moving on to the rest of the Solomon Islands. And finally, MacArthur would move on Rabaul, the Japanese base in the Southwest Pacific. Operations would begin on August 1st. But on July 5th, intelligence was received that changed the plan and promoted one of those place names in the story of the war, particularly in the history of the US Marine Corps. The Japanese were observed to be building an airbase on Guadalcanal.
And from that airfield, they based aircraft which could range over all of the Solomon Islands and further south. Occupation of Guadalcanal provided the Japanese air cover for that whole region, which meant that then any plans they had for that region could be covered by those aircraft.
This became the first priority of the counter-offensive. And on August 7th, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. It was the first landing by American forces in the Pacific.
8 months after Pearl Harbor, America hit back hard with a smashing blow at Japanese power.
The Marines who landed on Red Beach were 1st Marine Division under Major General Vandergrift. Their primary target was the airstrip that the Japanese had been constructing. Their task was codenamed Operation Watchtower. But there was so little time for planning and so few resources from which to construct the invasion force that it was nicknamed Operation Shoestring. The carriers of Task Force 61 would provide the only air cover. The 1st Marine Division would go in with only half its vehicles and 10 days' supply of ammunition, and the landing would be preceded by a single rehearsal. The invasion force evaded Japanese patrols, but Japanese ignorance was matched by that of the Americans, who had no real idea of the size of the defensive force awaiting them. Just after dawn on the 7th of August, the Marines went ashore, intent on striking out for the airfield and cancelling the threat of any land-based aircraft that were there. As they were to discover, the Japanese force established on Guadalcanal numbered 2,200. They were mainly construction workers, and they were taken completely by surprise.
The Americans captured Henderson Airfield very quickly. They occupied that on the 8th of August. And from that moment on, Henderson became a thorn in the side of the Japanese.
This is the airfield on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomons. In American hands, it's become a vitally important base from which to bomb Japanese warships and convoys.
The night after the initial landing, a Japanese naval task force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer caught an Allied force steaming through the 15-kilometre-wide channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, sinking the American and Australian cruisers with the loss of 1,270 Allied seamen and 34 Japanese dead. Following the Battle of Savo Island, the US Navy withdrew, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal without support. But the Japanese allowed their opportunity to pass, not bringing up reinforcements until August the 18th. The first Japanese counterattack went in on August the 21st. 900 men, commanded by Colonel Ichiki, attacked at the Battle of Tenaru River. The Americans lost 35 men. The Japanese were wiped out. Colonel Ichiki committed ritual suicide, and it is said that crocodiles feasted on the Japanese corpses. Later in August, continuing naval action in the waters around the Solomons further swung the advantage in favor of the Americans, whose fighters were by now operating from Henderson Field.
And with heavy air-sea blows in the great battle of the Pacific, the tide is certainly turning against Japan.
Supply to Imperial Japanese Army troops on Guadalcanal was limited.
The Japanese eventually started calling Guadalcanal Starvation Island. Their men were short of food and, of course, ammunition. Because of the inability to bring ships across during daylight, they resorted to what was called the Tokyo Express, which was destroyers running at high speed, bringing troops and supplies across.
The next significant attempt to displace the Marines was led by General Kawaguchi. The Battle of Bloody Ridge in mid-September was fiercely contested. The Japanese were driven back with 600 dead.
A main mistake the Japanese made in that regard was to launch repeated frontal assaults against the American defensive positions, which suffered very heavy losses. But they did it consistently and repeatedly. There didn't seem to be any variation in those tactics.
By late September, Marine strength under General van der Grift had risen to 23,000. And the Japanese, recognizing the struggle that they faced, had sent Lieutenant General Hyakutake from Rabaul and built their force to about 20,000. The battle for Guadalcanal raged from mid-October until the final Japanese evacuation at the beginning of February 1943. In November, the fighting was offshore, where 2 nights became known as the First and Second Battles of Guadalcanal. On the night of the 12th, both sides suffered heavy losses in a naval encounter, in which American forces came off worse, but did seriously disrupt an attempt to reinforce the garrison. The following night, the Americans again fared worse in terms of losses, but in this attritional war, it was the Japanese who could not afford to make good their losses.
At sea, the Japanese succeeded quite often against the US Navy. The Japanese were exceptionally good at night fighting. They defeated the US Navy on several occasions, and they never pressed their advantage at sea. They never pushed, and it's been an interesting aspect of the naval battle that if the Japanese had been more aggressive and pushed harder, the US Navy may well not have been able to hold its ground in that area.
Checked at sea, despite causing more damage than it suffered, the Japanese Navy was unable to reinforce or resupply Guadalcanal, where troops were now starving and short of everything needed to carry on the battle. In the first 2 weeks of December, the 1st US Marine Division, severely debilitated by 6 weeks of fighting and the depredations of tropical disease, was relieved by 3 Marine Divisions of 14th Corps, General Alexander Patch. Patch began offensive operations almost at once, and by early January, Japan realized that its position on Guadalcanal was not supportable. Losses to hunger and disease were far outstripping losses to enemy action. Evacuation was ordered, the troops to be taken to New Guinea. On January 23rd, the vital high point, Mount Austin, fell to the Americans, and on the night of February the 1st, the Japanese began to evacuate the island. A total of 11,000 troops were taken off by the Tokyo Express, and on the 9th, General Patch signaled that the Tokyo Express no longer has a terminus on Guadalcanal.
Not only is that battered island in our hands, but also American soldiers, sailors and Marines have shattered forever the myth of Japanese invincibility.
By the time Guadalcanal was secured, 1,600 Americans had been killed and as many as 32,000 Japanese lost to military action or disease.
The Japanese lost a great number of very highly experienced troops during the Solomons campaign. From that time on, the Pacific War became a war for Japan of defence and for the Allies of offence. And so Guadalcanal and the Solomon campaign has been, I think, quite rightly described as the turning point of the Pacific War.
In 1932, the British Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, declared that the bomber will always get through. The belief grew between the world wars that bombing would be a decisive weapon, that it would destroy civilian morale and therefore the will to go on fighting. Bombs were dropped on civilian targets in Italy's invasion of Abyssinia, Japan's invasion of China, and in the Spanish Civil War. They had not brought populations to their knees. Despite which, every combatant nation in the Second World War continued to believe that attacking the population would disrupt the war effort and speed a collapse. That belief was a mistake, because nowhere did the bombing of civilian targets, area bombing, significantly impede the ability or will to continue fighting.
The strategic bombing campaign arises originally as a strategy of desperation almost. France has fallen, the Low Countries have fallen, Britain essentially stands alone with the support of the Commonwealth. All of its European allies have gone. And it needs a way of striking back against Germany, partly for the morale of its own population, partly for political diplomatic purposes, that obviously the United Kingdom wants the support of the United States in the war. It wants to draw them in to the war. It needs to demonstrate that it is still a viable ally, that it is still fighting, so it needs to take the war to the Germans.
Germany has felt the growing might of the Royal Air Force. Soon America's strength will be added to ours.
They had not arranged for people who had done their 30 operations to come back and say to us, now fellas, this is the sort of thing that you've got to protect yourself against. Maintain your height at about, say, 7,000 feet or 10,000 feet. That'll be about the best protection you can get. But they didn't do that. All we had to do was just purely and simply raw recruits doing bombing raids on Germany.
The targeting of those raids through the summer of 1942 was the implementation of the man who had, on February 23rd, been appointed Chief of Bomber Command. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, who popular history would always remember as Bomber Harris.
There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet.
A turning point for Harris's strategy was the 17th of April, when 12 heavy Lancaster bombers raided the German city of Augsburg. 7 were lost, and Harris concluded that daylight raids were too costly.
It's quite ironic, really, because Britain, who has managed to defeat a German bombing campaign through a very well-integrated air defence network, it then wanders off quite naively to try and attack German industry, underestimating how costly that will be.
Within the week, the bombing campaign against Germany had switched to night raids.
Switching to night bombing reduces accuracy, so thus, in order to maintain the bombing campaign and seek to have an effect on German industry and to make up for the fact that they can't accurately hit pinpoint targets, there's a switch to area bombing. The idea being that if you're bombing areas, you will strike at the population that works in the factories.
On May 17th, Arthur Harris received Churchill's approval for a raid which would stretch his resources to the limit. The first raid by 1,000 bombers, codename Millennium.
Now is not the time, in any way, to ease up, but to put on what indeed may prove, sooner perhaps than some of us think, the final spurt.
The target was the city of Hamburg. The objective was to destroy the city. Harris managed to assemble more than 1,000 aircraft, but bad weather ruled Hamburg out. Cologne, the alternative target, felt the force of an attack that lasted for 75 minutes. A day later, just under 1,000 aircraft hit Essen, and 3 weeks later, 1,000 aircraft raided Bremen.
The camaraderie was excellent. The acceptance of losing a buddy was excellent. It was never a question of we shouldn't be here, we shouldn't be doing this. Never, by anyone.
The losses in aircraft and air crew were mounting, and the evidence that such massive raids were having a meaningful effect was slight. There would be no further 1,000-plane raids for 2 years. But Arthur "Bomber" Harris was rewarded for his questionable strategy. On June 14th, 1942, he was knighted. The strategy was continued throughout the war and at great cost. Not just in enormous loss of civilian life, but in the figures that point to an attrition rate amongst bomber crews that was, certainly in the British military, higher than any other part of the armed forces.
The campaign, particularly the British nighttime area bombing campaign, and the combined bomber offensive overall, was one of the more controversial and debated parts of the Second World War.
The bomber might always get through, but it did not seem capable of influencing events.
The British didn't completely undermine German morale, and Germany kept fighting.
The division of France following her capitulation was complex. Territorially, a line wound its way through France, separating the German-controlled area of occupation from the area under the control of the collaborationist government, centred on the spa town of Vichy.
Premier Reynaud was eased out of his position so that Marshal Pétain and General Weygand might make terms with Hitler. Only General de Gaulle and a remnant of gallant Frenchmen elected to carry on the struggle beside Britain.
Charles de Gaulle is the leader of the Free French. He is the personification of the liberty of France. But he's only got the French troops evacuated from Dunkirk. So what de Gaulle desperately needs is to bring some of France's colonial empire and its military resources into the fight against Germany.
Second most powerful in Europe, the French Navy was indeed a glittering prize for the Nazis.
The British were determined that such a significant weapon should not fall into German hands. And famously, Admiral el-Kabir on July 3rd joined battle against the Vichy fleet in the harbour, which had resisted calls to either surrender or sail to a neutral port.
Britain offered honourable terms with several alternatives, including a safe conduct to Martinique. These terms were refused. Then our grim duty was carried out.
More than 1,000 French sailors were killed. Attention turned to the French colonies, and particularly to the port of Dakar in French West Africa.
There's a lot hinging on this for de Gaulle. He has to persuade the French sailors, the French admirals in West Africa, to declare for the Allies and not for Vichy France.
A large Royal Navy task force, to which was joined an Australian heavy cruiser and 8,000 troops, including Free French under de Gaulle, sailed south from Gibraltar. Some of the vessels that had escaped from Mers el-Kabir and found safety in Toulon had themselves departed for French West Africa, days before Admiral Somerville led his Force H into the Atlantic. He had under command the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, 2 battleships, 5 cruisers, 10 destroyers and transports. It was quite a show. Waiting for them was a garrison, shore batteries, 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers, the vessels that had escaped from Toulon, and an incomplete battleship, the Richelieu. The first action was carried out by aircraft from the carrier Hermes, the first ship anywhere to have been designed as an aircraft carrier. Her Swordfish attacked Richelieu at her moorings on July 8th. The damage the battleship took immobilized her, but she remained a significant gun platform. Force H sailed south, passing Hermes, now joined by HMAS Australia, and anchored in Freetown, Sierra Leone. De Gaulle was confident that the Vichy garrison under the High Commissioner, Pierre-François Boisson, would come over to the cause of the Free French.
De Gaulle was an immensely charismatic figure. He's tall and he's persuasive, and he thinks he can persuade the French admirals to come to his side. He turns up with a British fleet and he uses his rhetorical magic on them, and it fails.
On September 23rd, aircraft of the Fleet Air Arm flew over Dakar, dropping propaganda leaflets. And the next day, aircraft operating off the Ark Royal landed at Dakar Airport in the expectation of a welcome and the commencement of discussions. They were immediately taken prisoner. A boat carrying de Gaulle's personal representatives entered Dakar harbour, where it was fired on and forced to withdraw. It was evident that de Gaulle had miscalculated the sentiments ashore. They would have to fight for the keys to the city. Later, on the 23rd, the first attempt to land troops south of the city was repelled due to fog and heavy fire from well-prepared positions. Rather abruptly, rather unexpectedly, the mission to bring Dakar into the Free French fold had turned into a battle. Force H was powerful, but it was not equipped to force a contested landing.
The admirals and indeed the sailors had a deep resistance to firing on the French. I mean, the French were allies. These men were not Germans. My feeling is that the British sailors' heart is not in this operation.
The resolute defence did not waver, and with de Gaulle saying he would not be responsible for Frenchmen killing Frenchmen, Force H was forced to withdraw. It returned to Freetown.
So Dakar is a big humiliation for all concerned, for the Royal Navy, for Cunningham, for de Gaulle, and for Churchill, who instigated it. So Dakar is one of those British operations which is not much spoken of, because it was in fact a total failure.
Here it is, Leningrad, a city of heroes, defiant of death, ready to die on their feet because they don't want to live on their knees.
The former imperial capital of St. Petersburg had been in a state of siege since the 8th of September 1941. In January 1943, Operation Iskra was launched. The Leningrad and Volkhov fronts succeeding in opening a land corridor that increased supply to the city.
During the long, heartbreaking months of Leningrad's ordeal, the people often ran out of the barest necessities of life: bread, coal, clothing. But the city's supply of courage was never low.
But the siege continued until January 1944, when the Soviet Leningrad-Novgorod strategic offensive of the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts, with the 1st and 2nd Baltic fronts, went in. In the late hours of January 13, 1944, long-range bombers from the Baltic Fleet attacked the main German command points on the defensive line.
Soviet aircraft leading the counter-offensive continue to give the Hun a bellyful of his own medicine.
And the following day, the offensive began, when the 2nd Shock Army, which had clung to the Iranian-bound bridgehead for the whole of the siege, attacked.
Time after time, they hurled themselves against the invader, driving him inch by inch back from the city's outskirts.
The next day, following an artillery barrage all along the front, the 42nd Army launched from the south. Although fog slowed progress for the first few days, the 42nd had linked with the 2nd Shock Army by the 19th. At the same time, the Volkhov front south of the city had begun to move on the German 18th Army, crossing a frozen lake and threatening the 18th's southern flank. On the 19th, the 2nd Shock Army captured Ropsha, and the 63rd Guards Rifle Division, part of the 42nd Army, drove the Germans out of Krasnoye Selo. On the 22nd, von Keukler, commanding Army Group North, asked Hitler for permission to withdraw the 18th, which was in danger of being encircled. Hitler refused, promising reinforcements. But when the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts launched their assault on the German salient beyond Kiev, no troops could be spared. The attacks by the 2nd Shock and 42nd Armies had cost the Germans about 21,000 casualties, captured 85 artillery pieces, and pushed the Germans back by between 60 to 100 kilometers. The day after the Ukrainian fronts moved, January 26th, Govorov's Leningrad front, in a general advance, cleared the Leningrad-Moscow railway line of enemy troops. On the 27th of January 1944, 872 days after it had begun, the siege was lifted.
Across the lake and into Leningrad, this train is but the first of many.
500,000 Axis soldiers were casualties, almost 3.5 million Soviet troops, and 1 million Leningrad civilians had died at the rate of more than 1,000 every day.
With what grief they mourned their dead, victims of German torture and massacre.
The death toll at Leningrad alone was greater than the total combined British and American losses for the whole war. Stalin declared the city to have been relieved, and Leningrad celebrated with a red, white and blue salute from 324 Katyusha rocket launchers. Leyte Gulf, the second battle of the Philippine Sea, was a decisive defeat for the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was their last defeat in set-piece action.
Japanese Navy on paper was quite formidable. They still had a number of fleet carriers, a number of battleships. What they didn't have was a naval air arm. They could barely muster 100 aircraft on their carrier strike group. They'd been totally outfought, not only at Midway but in a whole series of actions.
To compensate, a desperation weapon made its first appearance in the engagement. It was called Divine Wind, kamikaze.
Because the Japanese had lost most of their naval air power, they resorted to kamikaze tactics, in which pilots deliberately crashed their bomb-laden aircraft on enemy ships. This combined the Japanese military ethic with pragmatism, because it was the best way of utilising Japan's declining resources in aircraft and aviation fuel and the poor quality of its pilots, given the sophisticated and dense defensive measures protecting the American fleets. It required minimal pilot training. All the pilot had to do was take off, fly straight into level and dive straight into his target.
Kamikaze was an innovation, but it was needed because of the Imperial Japanese Navy's failure to prepare for the new age of naval warfare. The admirals of the Japanese Navy were schooled on the extraordinary success that their predecessors had enjoyed in smashing the Imperial Russian Navy 40 years before. That had been a victory for battleships, and it encouraged a belief in the value of the capital ship in a sea battle. So Admiral Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, devised a plan that would exploit the might of his battleships and turn the US Navy and its invasion fleet back from the Philippines.
The problem here was the complexity of the Japanese plan. In this case, the carriers who they assumed the Americans would be looking for, and indeed they were, they would be a decoy.
Using as bait his remaining carriers, Toyoda would lure the American 3rd and 7th Fleets into a trap that he set between two battleship groups drawn from the 1st striking force. But on the 23rd of October, the attack group was engaged by American submarines.
Before they reached the approaches to Leyte, the Japs lost the important element of supply. Our submarines, searching deep in enemy waters, surfaced right in the middle of the Japanese fleet.
2 cruisers were sunk. And this, rather than the bait, attracted the attention of 3rd Fleet Admiral Halsey. He turned south. He was under attack from land-based aircraft operating out of Luzon. They sank the carrier Princeton. But he sailed on to the first engagement.
Admiral Kurita was going to bring in the big battleships, including the two biggest in the world, the Musashi and the Yamato, with their 18-inch guns. This was going to be the main force.
Halsey's aircraft sank the battleship Musashi in an action known as the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. Admiral Kurita split his force, and 2nd Striking Force now sailed south to swing towards Leyte. Kurita passed through the narrow San Bernardino Strait before turning north towards the Mobile Fleet, the bait that hadn't been taken. Admiral Shima's 2nd Force was sailing into the jaws of Admiral Kincaid's 7th Fleet, which simply destroyed it. 2 battleships went down, Fuso and Yamashiro. Now Halsey, who had turned towards the Mobile Fleet, learned that the American invasion fleet was coming under pressure from Kurita.
Admiral Halsey had to make a difficult decision. Should he go to the rescue and ignore the surprise from the north? Should he hold his position and leave our small force off Samar to fight overwhelming odds?
Halsey let his carriers sail on. They sank all 4 of the bait carriers in the Mobile Fleet. And turned to deal with Kurita. The Japanese admiral doubled back on his course, making again for the San Bernardino Strait. This allowed the landings to go ahead.
Once those troops got ashore at Leyte, there were only 20,000 Japanese troops at Leyte to counter the 200,000 troops that had landed. The Leyte Gulf was the first time that all of the major commands in the Pacific joined up. So you had MacArthur coming up from Southwest Pacific area, Admiral Halsey, who'd been fighting his way up through the Solomons, and the Central Pacific area Nimitz coming across from Pearl Harbor. They all linked up in the Philippines.
The Battle of Leyte Gulf cost the Japanese 3 battleships, and it left the Imperial Navy with no aircraft carriers. The first encounter with kamikaze had unsettled nerves and sunk and damaged ships. But neither in Leyte Gulf nor in any subsequent engagement could they turn the tide of battle.
The Imperial Japanese Navy was now finished as an effective fighting force. The American Navy's dominance of the Pacific was complete. It was a bitter blow for the Japanese, but they were still determined to fight to the end.
On the 27th of April 1941, German troops entered Athens. The Greek resistance against the initial Italian invasion had crumbled before the German onslaught. British troops sent from North Africa to support the Greeks, Force W, had been pushed back until it was agreed that, in a Dunkirk-like operation, they should be evacuated. And as with Dunkirk, most of the equipment was lost.
It was, of course, thanks to the Royal Navy that evacuation was possible. They'd been through hard times during the battle, so the issue of special rations was doubly welcome.
The evacuation aboard cruisers, destroyers and transports ferried Force W to Crete, where they were formed up as Cree Force under Major General Freiberg. His defense of the island would last for 1 week. On April 25th, before taking Athens, Hitler had issued Directive Number 28, Operation Mercury. It ordered the capture of Crete.
Crete's an island in the Mediterranean. Its strategic significance essentially is the ability to use it as a base to project naval air power across the Mediterranean. If you control the Mediterranean, you control access to the Suez Canal, you're then forcing shipping to go the long way around. You're also then able to bring that to bear on the British position in North Africa and the Middle East.
But capturing the island was not an easy task. The plan deployed 10,000 paratroops to drop onto the island, a further 750 to land in gliders, 5,000 to be brought in by transports, and a further 7,000 to land by sea. The assault would begin on May 20th. Opposing them, Freyberg would have a mixed force of 30,000 British, Australian and New Zealand troops. He himself was a New Zealander, with 10,000 Greek troops. But his men were poorly equipped, having left most of their heavy weapons and armour on the mainland. But he had one advantage, thanks to Ultra. German plans had been intercepted and decoded, so Freyberg knew what to expect and when.
Into the beautiful countryside of Greece, the dictators brought all the ugliness of war. Their greatest superiority was in the air, and although Britain went to her aid, it was impossible to repel the enemy's overwhelming concentration of machine.
On May 15th, the Luftwaffe, 650 aircraft for Operation Mercury, began preliminary raids on Crete. Freyberg recognized that his own air defense was hugely outnumbered. So he ordered his aircraft off the island to Egypt. To compensate for the complete absence of air cover, he committed to making all of the island's airfields unusable. The day after the aircraft had been released, on May 20th, the attack began. German paratroops landing at 4 airfields. The attack was a disaster.
German airborne assault, for all its psychological impact, in most places in Crete struggled. For a start, the Germans didn't have enough planes to do it all in one hit, so they had to attack the west of the island before they attacked the east of the island, which of course gave early warning then to the forces deployed in the east of what was coming. German paratroopers dropped from a very low height. They were subject to a great deal of small arms fire and suffered very heavily on the descent.
All of the glider-borne troops and 4 of the parachute battalions were smashed to pieces before they could join the fight. Of the 600 men of the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Air Landing Assault Regiment, 400 were killed on that first day. By the end of May 20th, the German invaders had failed to secure any of their objectives, and Hitler ruled out any further airborne operations, ever. On the 20th and 21st, convoys sailing in support of the landing were repulsed by the Royal Navy. In action in the waters around Crete, the Navy lost several ships, and others, including Ajax, which had figured in the Battle of the River Plate, took damage. But in repulsing the convoy, Force D destroyed half the troop-carrying vessels, and the only damage the Navy suffered was from what is now called friendly fire. The German command decided to gather and concentrate all of its forces on a single objective, the airfield at Malemi. Their job was made easy, because in a confusion of orders and breakdowns in communication, the troops defending Malemi had withdrawn.
By grabbing hold of Malemi, they then had the capacity to reinforce and reinforce rapidly before moving west to then bring aid to the German troops fighting at Retamo and Heraklion.
Freyberg ordered a counterattack to retake the airfield, but it failed because the Germans had undisputed air superiority. Freyberg was criticised then and has been criticised since for an inadequate defence of the airfield at Malemi, which now became a German staging post.
Because of the intelligence that he had, it perhaps forced him to be a little blinded to the situation, that he didn't actually form a mobile reserve for contingencies that he didn't see, and particularly once Malemi airfield was lost, he had no real ability to respond to the German foothold there.
On the 22nd of May, a night attack which would neutralise Axis air support was ordered. But an unexplained delay in giving the order turned the operation into a day attack, which failed under the howling of Stuka dive bombers. Further attempts to land reinforcements by sea were frustrated by the Royal Navy, which forced a planned invasion fleet to turn away on May 23rd. Further naval reinforcements were sent from Malta to join the battle. But as 3 destroyers, Kelly, Kashmir and Kipling, were rounding the western side of the island, they were attacked by 24 Stukas. Kashmir was hit, turned turtle, and later sank. Kipling survived 83 bombs, and Kelly, commanded by Captain Lord Louis Mountbatten, was hit and sank in 2 minutes. The Germans, by now, were landing reinforcements at Malemi. Freyberg had not, after all, rendered all of the airfields unusable. By May 27th, he decided that the battle for Crete was lost. His commander, General Wavell, endorsed that view, and London authorized an evacuation. By now, the Germans had superiority in every arm: air, artillery, manpower. And they pushed the Allies south with motorcycle and specialized mountain troops hard at them. Despite gallant rearguard actions by commando units and companies of the Maori Battalion, only 18,600 of the 32,000 Allied troops on the island were taken off. And many of those failed to reach safety as their transport came under aerial attack.
The Germans now had Crete, they now had its airfields, they could now project naval and air power out from that island across the Mediterranean. Longer term, it also just made the position in the Mediterranean a lot more tenuous for the Allied forces.
But the greatest victims of the loss of Crete were the people of the island. Throughout the years of occupation, well-documented atrocities, including the massacres of whole villages, extracted a heavy price from the ordinary people of Crete for their resistance to the German invasion. Every battle is both a victory and a defeat. It depends which flag you fly. In every theatre of the Second World War, battles won and lost determined possession of territory, of resources, and of the strength to go on fighting. For some of the battles, it was the victory that most influenced the future course of the war. For others, it was the defeat. This is the story of the battles won and lost that decided the outcome of the greatest conflict in history. A world war is a patchwork of actions. Land, sea, air, massive or small scale. And the stories of these actions are just as varied. Here are battles decided by amphibious forces, climate, geography, and the problems of supply. The naval revolution that had been hinted at in the Coral Sea would be fully realized at Midway. A battle for which Japan gathered massive naval strength.
The Japanese objective at Midway was to destroy the US Navy. And to do this, they decided to move on Midway Island. Midway Island was an island on the Hawaii defence perimeter. And the plan was to entice the US Navy into a trap and destroy it, which would, of course, if that had occurred, it would have given the Japanese free rein over the west coast of the USA, and they would have also had the opportunity to attack Hawaii.
American patrols sighted Japanese warships and troop transports several hundred miles out at sea, heading for this island of Midway. He decided that this was the place to make a stand, and committed all available ships to a bold attack.
The Japanese Navy was, as had been proven early in the 20th century, when she destroyed the Imperial Russian fleet, a match for anyone. But repeatedly, in the story of battles won and lost in the Second World War, we find the difference between victory and defeat rests with the difference between concentration and dispersal.
The problem with the Japanese was that they had scattered their fleet over a very wide area. It was organised into component parts, none of which could support each other. So, in effect, as a total number, the Japanese outnumbered the Americans, but when it came to a face-to-face battle, they didn't.
The American fleet went into the battle with another advantage, because the Coral Sea encounter ruled both Zuikaku and Shokaku out of the Midway engagement. Yorktown, on the other hand, which was estimated to require 3 months for repair, was swarmed over by 1,400 workers, and they had the job done in 2 days. She was in the line of battle. The Japanese had a complicated plan. The second carrier strike force would go north to the Aleutians. Midway, near enough midway between Hawaii and Japan, would be approached across a broad front of ocean. A significant force would break off to possibly support action in the Aleutians. It was labelled the Aleutians Screening Force. The fleet proper would divide. The invasion force under Admiral Kondo would hold back. The main body under Yamamoto would also wait, allowing Nagumo to press the attack with the first carrier strike force, built around the 4 carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. To the south of the main force was the close support force under Admiral Kurita. In the event, Admirals Kurita, Yamamoto and Kondo would play no part in this most decisive battle. The Americans, by contrast, were sailing to the battle zone in a compact formation. Rear Admiral Jack Fletcher, Task Force 17, again flying his flag from Yorktown, and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance in Task Force 16 with the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, giving the Americans 3 carriers to the Japanese 4. But the Americans had another advantage. They knew exactly what to expect. Their crypto-analysts had cracked the Japanese naval code.
They could read Japanese orders, they knew Japanese plans, they knew where the Japanese would be and in what strength. It was absolutely decisive.
A submarine patrol was on station at Midway, and aircraft based there could extend surveillance to about 500 kilometers from the island. The stage was set. Around 4:30 in the morning of June 4th, Nagumo, steaming about 400 kilometers northwest of the island, initiated the action by committing about half of his total air arm to an attack on Midway. The battle continued in bursts over the next 2 days. The course of the Battle of Midway was first influenced by Admiral Nagumo's decision when his aircraft returned to their ships, and his pilots reported a failure to completely destroy the installations and aircraft on Midway. Nagumo ordered them to be rearmed with bombs rather than torpedoes for a second attack on the island. At 5:45, after a Catalina had sighted the Japanese task force, the American carriers turned towards the enemy that they would engage but never see.
With carrier warfare, it was quite clear the person who struck first was going to win. And Japanese lost that little advantage, and the Americans were able to conduct an extraordinarily successful strike. Had the Japanese found the Americans first and focused on conducting a mass strike against the Americans, it could have gone the other way.
Enterprise and Hornet launched their first attacks on the Japanese ships shortly after 6. They launched 29 torpedo bombers, of which they lost 24. These were outdated Devastator aircraft, and after Midway, they were withdrawn from service. They had failed to record a single hit on a Japanese ship, but they had, most importantly, disorganized the enemy fleet and forced its air cover down to sea level. Above them, squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown went in. It was mid-morning, and these were the much more effective Dauntless aircraft, responsible for sinking more Japanese vessels than any other weapon. The battle would continue, but its outcome was decided in 5 minutes. Nagumo gave the order to launch at 10:20, but at 10:25, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey of the USS Enterprise's Air Group led his 37 Dauntless dive bombers in from an altitude of 14,000 feet in a 70-degree dive at 280 knots. The carrier Akagi was hit first. Then Kaga. Last, Soryu, as dive bombers from Yorktown joined the assault. Aircraft from the remaining Japanese carrier meanwhile hit Yorktown, but the losses in aircraft were great.
Japanese planes were shot down by the score. One flew slap into this.
These losses meant that Hiryu, though she remained active, was weakly protected, and in the last carrier action of June 4th, came under attack from the Dauntless dive bombers, so that as the sun set, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking. Yorktown, too, was in a bad state and had to be abandoned. During the night of the 4th of June, Japan's 4 carriers were either sunk or scuttled. The main Japanese force had by now sailed to within range of the Midway-based B-17, and these attacked as, during the 6th, the American fleet searched the seas.
The first day we hit about 30 ships of all types, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports. Second day we hit the carriers.
Any luck with them?
Oh, yes.
Knocked them right in there.
The Yorktown was taken in tow, but both the carrier and the destroyer Hamam that had come to her aid were sunk by torpedoes from a Japanese submarine. News of the engagement was passed to Prime Minister Tojo in Tokyo in suitably formal, courtly style. The Navy, he was told by General Moritaki Tanabe, has made a great mistake. Midway was a decisive naval battle whose outcome was decided not by ships, but by almost 500 aircraft. Midway has always been a candidate for turning point. Was the outcome of the war in the Pacific decided in those 2 days of naval action? What happened placed the American and Japanese fleets on an approximately equal footing. What happened next most influenced the course of the war. Between Midway and 1944, Japan built 6 new fleet carriers. The United States built 14.
America is building freighters by day and night. Red-hot rivets and red-hot rivet catchers are on the job. They're turning out the ships, and the ships are delivering the goods.
The production capacity was central to what happened in the rest of the War of the Pacific. The American industrial machine was gearing up in 1942, and its products really started to come out in mass numbers in 1943.
If Midway was a victory at sea, it was made decisive by the shipyards and factories that could make good the losses in a way that Japan simply could not match.
The Japanese, on the other hand, had no similar mass building program, nor the ability to mobilize such large numbers of educated people. And I think that's a very important point. It's not just the extraordinary American industrial output that gave you so many aircraft carriers, so many aircraft, so many battleships, and so many other ships. It was this extraordinary ability to take an educated population and train them for people who'd never seen the sea to go out and be effective sailors, officers at all levels.
Hitler's position after a disastrous winter on the Russian front placed him in a dilemma. Either he must push on into the Caucasus and dangerously extend his front, or he must somehow contrive to do without the vital Caucasian oil field.
When, with summer, the German assault on the Soviet Union was renewed, there were 51 German divisions across Europe and 167 on the Eastern Front. They were supported by 30 from various Axis partners and sympathizers.
In a sense, German summer offensive of 1942 was like Barbarossa remastered. Yet again, the Germans were facing this enormous fields, a lot of resistance. They were taking a lot of prisoners of war. So the idea behind it was that now the Soviet Union will collapse. Now the Russian resistance will die down, which happened and not happened at the same time.
German battle plans were designated full or case and identified by color. Case blue, the plan for the summer offensive of 1942, was detailed as Directive 41 and issued in April. The major role was to be shouldered by von Bock's Army Group South. The prize would be the Caucasus, and while the jewel in that particular crown was the oil fields, from the perspective of wide strategy, an advance into the Caucasus also meant advancing the front past Moscow.
The Nazis would have a base from which to launch a flanking attack on Moscow. With one master stroke, the Russian armies to the south would be practically cut off from Caucasus oil.
In a preliminary action, von Manstein's 11th Army attacked in the Crimea on May 8th. 4 days later, completely surprising the Germans, the Russians launched their own offensive. Timoshenko, commanding the Southwest Theater, exploiting the salient that had been created south of Kharkov. Germany had plans to nip out the salient. The Russians beat them to it by 6 days. So Operation Friderikus was brought forward. In 3 days, the Russians had penetrated more than 40 kilometers, but they were overcautious in committing their armor. When von Kleist attacked with 15 divisions and von Paulus brought the 6th Army in on the flank, Stalin refused to vary the offensive order. When Army Group Kleist and the 6th Army on the 22nd trapped the Soviet forces in the pocket they had tried to exploit, only 22,000 Soviet troops managed to escape the encirclement. The the failed offensive cost the Soviet Union almost 250,000 men taken prisoner. And now, the main German offensive could begin. The 6 armies of Army Group B moved at the end of June. By the 6th of July, they had crossed the Don. The next day, the Russians evacuated Voronezh. Von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army would turn south, crossing the Don close to where it entered the Sea of Azov, forcing Malinovsky's south front back and reaching the oil fields at Maykop on August 9th.
True, they did capture a few, but this was the scene when they got there. The Russians, carrying out their scorched earth policy with complete thoroughness, had themselves fired the wells and the storage tanks.
On the following day, August 10th, von Paulus crossed the Don and reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The advance into the Caucasus continued, and on August 23rd, the swastika was hoisted on Europe's highest peak, Mount Elbrus, 5,642 meters.
This is the high point of the German advance into Russia. But the deeper they go into Russia, the bigger the problem becomes. And the very same day, the day they raise the flag on Mount Elbrus, they also enter Stalingrad. So in a sense, the German success carries within it the seeds of its own destruction.
The battle for the Caucasus and occupation of the vital oil fields had been won. But the outcome of the battle for Russia and for the living space in the East that Hitler had promised to the German people was very finely balanced. The British have a tradition of leaders who bring to the art of war a sort of mystery, mysticism, charisma. Ord Charles Wingate was very much of that lineage.
He had a background in guerrilla warfare. He fought a guerrilla campaign in Palestine before the war. He was a man who propounded his beliefs, advocated his beliefs with messianic zeal. He was argumentative and wouldn't take no for an answer. He was a very difficult subordinate.
Wingate's idea advanced for its time, and causing him to argue long and hard with his superiors, was for a special force that could operate behind enemy lines. Deep penetration was the expression, and the very technical term was asymmetric warfare.
The Japanese would then have to divert troops from the front line to deal with these issues in their rear. He prosaically called it having your hand in the enemy's bowels. That idea took hold. It was decided to give it a try, and the 77th Brigade was created. It was based on groups of British, Indian and Gurkha troops with commandos, signallers, Burmese guides and interpreters. They would go behind the Japanese lines as Wingate intended, and they were called Chindits because the Chindit was a mythical Burmese creature that guarded Buddhist temples.
Here they are, for the first time in newsreels, the Chindits, a name from legend that's become flesh and blood, living guardians of Burma's safety.
The first intention was to incorporate the deep penetration tactic into a larger campaign. But when that was cancelled, Wingate persuaded General Wavell in overall command to allow the Chindit operation to go ahead. That action became known as Operation Longcloth. It was first and foremost an attempt to prove Wingate's concept, and the force numbered just 3,000. On February 13th, 1943, the Chindits crossed the Chinwin River and entered Burma, modern Myanmar. 2 days later, they engaged Japanese troops.
The Japs had been outfought and outmaneuvered just where they thought that they were safely tucked away.
2 columns marched south, but they were a deception. 5 columns, the main campaign, marched east. two making for the main north-south railway with sabotage in mind. On March 4th, one column succeeded in its aims, wrecking the railway in as many as 70 places.
The Japanese quickly repaired the railway. The raid didn't cause any disruption to their plans or dispositions, and it didn't inflict many casualties. It also consumed a large slice of the air resources and other resources in the Burma theatre, where resources were very scarce.
Wingate himself repeatedly changed plans and destinations, but communications were poor, not least because the terrain was harsh and the columns were behind enemy lines, so column commanders were not always informed of Wingate's new intentions. The nature of the operation and terrain meant that the men were heavily burdened with supplies.
The kit of a man who will live and fight for months cut off in the jungle is an all-important factor. General Wingate knew how vital it is to carry the things you need.
It also meant that frequently the wounded had to be left, where possible, in the care of villagers. The resupply by air, a single RAF squadron of 6 aircraft was responsible, was adequate, but lack of a clear objective was becoming an issue. Wingate elected to cross the Irrawaddy, but here terrain was difficult, and the Japanese were able to maneuver in a way that threatened to trap Wingate's command in an ever-contracting box. With his forward elements now operating at the extreme limit of the range of air supply, Wingate decided in late March to withdraw his force. Here, the decision to cross the Irrawaddy took an awful toll. The need to cross the river to return to India meant that the Japanese could concentrate their forces along its banks, and as soon as an attempted crossing was sighted, numbers could be concentrated to contest the crossing.
The losses were catastrophic. Wingate was wrong in thinking that the Japanese would be panicked because of some issues in their rear areas. That was never going to happen. They were easily able to seal these Chindit penetrations off.
This forced the columns to fragment, and small groups of men continued to trickle back to their base until the end of April. 3,000 had set out. 818 did not return, killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Of the 2,187 who did return, about 600, so weakened by sickness or their wounds, would never return to active service. Operation Longcloth had then halved the effectiveness of the force that set out on its 3-month campaign. A battle lost, but one from which Wingate drew many lessons.
Wingate is convinced that these long-range penetrations by his Chindits are the best way of taking the war to the Japanese, the best way of regaining Burma. In his mind, conventional operations are now subsidiary. And he was able to get the resources needed to mount a much larger raid in 1944.
But Wingate would not play a significant role. In March, the plane on which he was travelling crashed, and he was killed. He was 41 years old.
We mourn his loss, but we know that his teaching will bear fruit in due course. These are the men of the long-range penetration group. Their fighting behind the enemy lines in Burma has made them a name throughout the world. That is the epitaph for Charles Ord Wingate.
As summer warmed the Soviet soil in 1944, the entire Eastern Front moved. A dozen Soviet army groups, from the Karelian Front in the north to the 3rd Ukrainian Front on the shores of the Black Sea, were in some way involved in a great offensive that Stalin had named for a hero of the Napoleonic Wars, Operation Bagration. The offensive was, at its heart, the drive to expel German forces, which still stood in great numbers on Soviet soil. It was the drive on the Vistula, and its climax coincided with the breakout from Normandy.
The Germans were in big trouble in the west and they needed to shore up the Western Front. The problem was that exactly the same time, the Russians put in a huge offensive, 1.7 million men over the entire front, and they were in a position to do in 1944 what the Germans had done with Operation Barbarossa in 1941.
In preliminaries, the 21st Army of the Leningrad Front began the attack. The Karelian Front joining the offensive 10 days later. On both fronts, the Finns, armed by the Germans and supported by one German division, were driven back. And then, on June 22nd, the day after the Karelian Front had moved and the third anniversary of the German invasion of Russia, Operation Bagration opened.
Белорусской операции, да, мы чувствовали, что он готовится, поскольку стала поступать артиллерия. Не дали 16 человек, возможно, стало 28 человек. Ждем пополнения, это было из Средней Азии.
The Soviets had deployed 300 guns per kilometer on a 560-kilometer front, from Smolensk through to Minsk in Belarusia.
As always, Russian artillery has been right in the forefront of the picture. Gunners of the Northern Army smashed German efforts to delay the Soviet advance.
The Soviet fronts began their surge towards four Axis army groups. Cherniakovsky's 3rd Belarusian moved on the 23rd. Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian the next day. And they advanced tenaciously for 10 weeks.
And it was that attack that broke through and was so effective in blitzkrieg-type tactics, which you'd seen developing since Stalingrad, worked very successfully in the counterattack at Kursk in 1943. The Russians are pretty good at this by 1944.
The 1st Baltic Front, General Bagration, and the 3rd Belarusian Front, Cherniakovsky, opened the Vitebsk-Orsha offensive, driving into Lithuania.
While Soviet forces are annihilating Germans in one great town after another, their comrades have been driving on at the rate of 20 miles a day, into Latvia, into Lithuania, closing rapidly on the very birthplace of Germany's incorrigible military cult, East Prussia.
По Белоруссии, значит, шли от болота. Вот где тяжело было по болотам. Там дорога через лес. Чем хорошо было, что у нас широкие были гусеницы, да. Это большое дело было для нас. Мы даже вот так вот. Они, во-первых, хорошо поднимали, по 30 градусов могли заходить в гору, так? Запросто шли.
On the huge eastern front, tanks go forward in pursuit of other retreating Germans.
By the 27th, Vitebsk had fallen, and the 3rd Panzer Army was lost.
German tanks and fortifications received very heavy punishment, and defences, which Hitler thought to be an almost impregnable barrier, were now overrun.
Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian front was swinging up towards Minsk, Cherniakovsky swinging down to meet him. 2nd Belarusian front, General Zakharov, crossed the river Dnieper, aiming directly for Minsk.
These Russian newsreels also show the crossing of the Dnieper. This was carried out by bridge and boat under continuous fire, but it was carried out, as we all know.
3rd Belarusian front reached and crossed the river Berezina the next day. In 2 weeks, Operation Bagration had penetrated 160 kilometers on a 400-kilometer front. Army Group Center's 37 divisions were pulverized by 166 Soviet divisions, supported by 2,700 tanks and 1,300 assault guns. Seven of Army Group Center's generals had been killed in the action. Second Belarusian Front continued its advance. This was the Mogilev Offensive, which forced opposing troops back on the Berezina, where they would be trapped.
Вот форсирование реки Березина и удержание плацдарма нашей части бойцов. Мы успешно удержали плацдарм, позволили другим переправиться частям. И дальше пошло наступление своим ходом. За этот бой я получил первый орден славы, 3-й степени.
Rokossovsky's forces broke through the supposedly impassable Pripyat marshes, his engineers having crossed them with wooden causeways. By June 27th, he had encircled 2 German corps east of Bobruisk, which was liberated on June 29th. The Allies had landed at Normandy 3 weeks previously, but to contrast the scale of the operations, for the duration of the summer, German casualties in the east outstripped those in the west by 4-1. 90% of all Germans killed in combat died on the Eastern Front, more between July 1944 and May 45 than in the preceding 5 years.
I think the Germans simply didn't have the resources. They were massively outgunned in every field, even in the air, in tanks, in mobile artillery, manpower. They just were being beaten down by vastly superior forces. And that had been coming in 41, 42, 43. By the time they got to 44, you're really dealing with an army in serious trouble.
The Minsk offensive pressed on. 5th Panzer Division was rushed forward to plug approaches to the city. But on July the 3rd, the 2nd Guards Tank Corps of the Red Army broke into the city. By the end of July 4th, the city had fallen. 40,000 of its defenders encircled and Army Group Center destroyed.
The advance continued with the successful results which we know. Not the least of these results have been more prisoners. Just one instance of the increasing drain on German manpower.
Наша армия пошла ускоренным маршем вперед окружать Минск. В направлении Борисова мы пошли по лесам, по болотам, мимо озера Нарочь и туда, к границе Литвы. Мы делали по 70 километров в сутки. Вот за это время прошли более 400 километров.
By July the 11th, Germany had lost 28 divisions. More than 30 generals had been killed or captured, and the Red Army had advanced 650 kilometers. Rokossovsky's forces reached the River Bug, the original Polish border. They reached the eastern banks of the Vistula on the 25th and turned to threaten Warsaw.
At the end of this campaign, the Russians are right next to Warsaw. They're right next to Ploesti in Romania. They're about to take the last oil fields away from the Germans.
And there, Stalin held, gathering his strength for the final devastating assault that would carry the Red Army into Berlin and see the Soviet flag hoisted on the ruins of the Reichstag. After the Normandy landings, the Allies poured more and more men and materiel ashore. And as they moved away from their beachhead, the lines of supply extended and the need for supply increased.
Every conceivable kind of material, requiring thousands of ships and landing craft to ensure steady progress against a determined enemy. It's certainly no picnic these days being in one of the Army supply organizations.
As the campaign moved into the second half of 1944, the situation became critical. The failure to take Dunkirk was a setback. The Belgian port of Antwerp, potentially vital, was in Allied hands by early September, and it was virtually undamaged. But the marine approaches to Antwerp were unique, and they posed a problem. The port sits at the mouth of the Scheldt. Ships entering must sail up the estuary, and the estuary was flanked along the channel by German defences and guarded at its mouth by the island of Walcheren. General von Zengen, recently sent to take over 15th Army, energetically built up the defences, determined to deny use of Antwerp to the Allies.
This battle, of course, was a vital part of the struggle to free the approaches to Antwerp, and the importance of Antwerp as a supply port certainly needs no stressing.
Canadian divisions faced the estuary and launched their assault in late October.
The force arrived early in the morning and landed in the face of heavy opposition on a small beachhead which was under continuous fire from German batteries inland.
The 2nd Division pressed across the peninsula and into South Beveland, taking Hoofs on October 29th. They were moving to link up with other units that had come in from the sea. 4th Special Service Brigade, as it was then called, now 4th Commando, landed on Walcheren on November 1st. Rather whimsically, their action was called Operation Infatuate. 47th and 48th Commandos landed on the northwest tip of the island, and an infantry brigade with commando elements on the southwest tip.
From the violence of the enemy's defence, two things are perfectly clear. First, the value Germany placed on denying Antwerp to us. Second, the supreme determination, skill and courage of our troops making this frontal assault on the Walcheren beachheads.
The shells would come down and we all got smacked. I just remember spinning around and hitting the sand and shouting something like, take cover to the lads. And where did they go? They ran into the German pillboxes, didn't they? Not the ones who fired at us, but the ones who were just about to give up.
The Canadians, having fought their way through Beveland, crossed the slow channel on the 3rd. The island was an unpleasant place to fight. The RAF had breached local dikes and the ground was flooded. But by the 8th, von Zangen's defence had been defeated. And as soon as a channel had been cleared through the mines, Allied shipping began to use Antwerp.
By the opening of the great port of Antwerp, with its miles of docks and its vast facilities for the landing of supplies, our minesweepers have magnificently rounded off the work of the armies in Holland.
Supply, securing material for one's own army, or denying it to the enemy, grew more vital as war became more mechanized. The use of the great port of Antwerp was a significant gain for the Allied forces as they prepared themselves for the advance across Europe, towards the Rhine and beyond. Its significance was not lost on German high command. The attempt to defend the approaches to Antwerp had failed. But the idea of launching a drive that could retake the port, or at least deny it to the Allies, was brought into German planning. Could enough material, enough men, be marshalled to make a surprise counterthrust, almost mirroring the first great blitzkrieg that had dashed to the Channel in 1940? And if such a counter-offensive could be launched, might it not alter the outcome of the war? The eyes of the German High Command returned to that part of the front where they had so successfully attacked when the war first crashed into France. The Ardennes. The war in the West was, it seemed, moving steadily, predictably to its climax. On the 8th of November, the day that Patton began his offensive in the Saar, the French First Army moved on the Belfort Gap. By the middle of the month, there were formations in motion all along the line. The American 1st and 9th Armies to the north of Patton, elements of the US 7th entering Strasbourg on the 2nd, and the 6th entering the Maginot Line on the day that the first vessels entered and started to use the port of Antwerp.
Operation Watch on the Line, as this operation was called from the German side, was the last major German offensive of World War II. They were being squeezed between the Russians, who were advancing in the east, and the British and American and other Allied forces who were coming at them from the west. And so Hitler had to do something. He couldn't just fight a rearguard action that would always just end in disaster.
Properly labelled the Ardennes counter-offensive, history remembers it as the Battle of the Bulge.
As we approached the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans were about to attack in a place that they had attacked in 1870, 1914, 1940, and now they're about to do it in 1944. And as in every other attack, they will be successful in achieving complete surprise.
Where the Germans surged, the 145-kilometre front was held by 4 American divisions, with one inexperienced armoured division, the 9th, in support. 2 of the 4 infantry divisions had been sent to the quiet Ardennes to recuperate, and a third, the 106th, had never been in action. Onto this force fell 2 panzer armies, which in hours had created an 80-kilometre salient, the Bulge.
In 24 hours, the initiative changed hands, and the German army, which had put the word blitzkrieg into all languages, unleashed its desperate offensive.
A short bombardment had pushed Allied heads down before the armour came forward under cover of heavy fog, which neutralised Allied air superiority.
It may not be like 1918, but it's certainly not like 1940. The Hun has won a success. How big remains to be seen.
Progress in the north fell behind schedule, but 1st Panzer Corps made good ground and was dashing for the Meuse bridges. The 5th Panzer Army brushed aside the 106th, but slowed against the experienced 28th Division. It was late afternoon before Allied High Command realised that what was happening was an all-out offensive rather than a feint.
The Allies were taken completely by surprise. They were overconfident. They were so busy planning how they would take Hitler's forces apart, it didn't seem to really occur to anybody that he was making a plan to take their forces apart.
Our command was taken totally by surprise. So they reacted in an extreme. Everything that could fly flew to bomb their supply train. And I can remember seeing the sky just filled with airplanes. It was really quite a sight.
Allied confusion was increased, in part due to the discovery of 150 Germans who, dressed as Americans, had penetrated Allied lines under the command of Otto Skorzeny, the man who, in September 1943, had rescued Mussolini.
As part of Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler came up with the idea of creating an infiltration force that would get through the Allied lines in order to capture the key bridges on the River Meuse. But really their real impact, ironically, came when the first unit was captured. And it suddenly became known to the Americans that there were these Germans wandering around behind their lines, dressed as Americans with American equipment, and panic ensued. So suddenly everybody was suspicious of everybody else.
On the 18th, Eisenhower halted the advance on the Rhine and gave priority to repelling the Ardennes offensive. The German onslaught slowed. Fuel was becoming a problem. By the 22nd, the 6th Panzer Army had stopped altogether. Units were losing contact with each other. Von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, which had surrounded Bastogne, was pushing forward. But that is as far as the Germans got. The 3rd US Army under Patton now brought pressure from the south. And with the weather clearing, the overwhelming Allied air supremacy started to tell.
Perhaps no general other than Patton, in the western side anyway, could have been quite as successful at turning his army to come to the rescue of those at Bastogne. He drove his forces hard, they got there quickly, and it was a very impressive example of the skill of generalship. But I think it's too easy to oversimplify and say that the battle was won because of Patton, that this was Patton's victory. There were many facets that, in the end, resulted in the Germans being defeated.
The attack was blunted, the spearhead stopped, the Nazi columns contained and thrown back by men who had flung themselves into the breach.
The Ardennes offensive cost each side about 80,000 casualties, losses from which the Allies could recover, but not the Axis.
The Germans, yes, they were able to concentrate significant forces in that theatre, but they couldn't sustain them. They couldn't replace the forces that they lost, and they just didn't have the supplies to keep their force going. Americans could always do that. They had that capability.
The German offensive had been blocked and then reversed. The losses inflicted equaled those sustained, and with the counter-offensive, Axis forces were falling back all along the front. The Bulge had held up the Allied push across the Rhine for 6 weeks, but it had only been held up. Crossing the Rhine was the last barrier before Eisenhower's armies poured into the fatherland.
We were going to be the thrust into mainland Germany. And all we knew was Germany was across the river, and we all piddled in the river for good luck.
Patton crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim. The next night, Montgomery crossed at Emmerich. The battle was won. German soil was underfoot, and the war in Europe, that had started 68 months earlier, was almost over. Every battle is both a victory and a defeat. It depends which flag you fly. In every theater of the Second World War, battles won and lost determined possession of territory, of resources, and of the strength to go on fighting. For some of the battles, it was the victory that most influenced the future course of the war. For others, it was the defeat. This is the story of the battles won and lost that decided the outcome of the greatest conflict in history. Through history, armies marched to face each other on favored ground and clashed to decide a campaign, a war, an empire. With the 20th century, that changed. The battles won and lost of the Second World War happened everywhere and anywhere, in freezing temperatures, arid deserts, and mercilessly humid jungles. These were battles in which more than the enemy soldier had to be overcome. The day after the fall of Singapore, John Curtin, the Australian Prime Minister, said that the battle for Australia has begun.
That every human being in this country is now, whether he or she likes it, at the service of the government to work in the defence of Australia.
And it did seem probable that Japan would continue to drive south. They had so far been unstoppable on land.
In July 1942, you're looking at probably the most critical time of the Pacific War. You're coming on from months and months of just constant Japanese victories. They've swept everything that stood before them in the Southeast Asia and then swept down through the Dutch East Indies, taken a whole raft of Pacific islands.
The extraordinary speed with which Japan had swept over the lands they now labelled the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere owed much to surprise, to planning, to determination, so that when they were checked on one of the most hellish battlefields it is possible to imagine, it was as though a myth had been exposed. This was the action to cross the Owen Stanley Range and fall on the New Guinea capital of Port Moresby.
The Japanese want it so that they can cement their southern defensive arc and also use that position to then harass the northern Australian cities and try and sever the link between Australia and the US. They're also really concerned that Australia may be used as a launching pad for a counter-offensive, so that's why their designs are there on Port Moresby.
In July 1942, a small force comprising an Australian and a New Guinea battalion was sent from Moresby to trek overland to Buna. There was a small airfield at Buna, and General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Western Pacific Theatre, decided that he would need it for future operations.
In the Pacific, the Allies face a very tough enemy in the Jap. These Australians fighting in Papua know just how tough, and they know how big a job it's going to be to oust the Jap from his recently conquered empire of islands.
The force that set off was named Maroubra Force. In mutual ignorance, another force would be trekking towards them.
Initially, the Japanese wanted to take Port Moresby by sea in an impressive amphibious landing. However, the Japanese defeat at Coral Sea and then later on at Midway meant the Japanese weren't able to do this by sea. And instead they decided to land a small force on the sort of northeast tip of Papua, on the northern beaches around Buna, Gona and Sanananda, with a view of attempting to move inland across the impressive Owen Stanley Range towards Port Moresby, along a foot track which we now know as the Kokoda Trail or the Kokoda Track.
A force of 2,000 under Colonel Yosuke Yokoyama had landed at Gona on July 21st, 6 days after Maroubra Force had reached Kokoda. 2 days later, first contact was made between the Japanese and the heavily outnumbered Australians. The war diary for the Australian 39th Battalion says this for July 27th. Lieutenant Colonel Owen, after the destruction of all possible stores, material and buildings at Kokoda, withdrew with all troops. It was the beginning of a fighting withdrawal down the track towards Moresby, which stopped a mere 50 kilometres from the capital, whose lights the Japanese could see.
Fighting withdrawal is distinct from a retreat. In a retreat, you're basically trying to break contact with the enemy, get as far away from them as you can so you can take stock and then really try and counterattack. Fighting withdrawal, you're deliberately maintaining contact with the enemy because you want to slow down their advance as long as you can. And the Australians did that really successfully in the early part of September.
The Aussies rightly claim to be some of the toughest troops in the world, but fighting in New Guinea would sap the strength of the toughest. It's not hard to understand the temporary exhaustion of these men Having just been relieved, they've come out of the jungle front line for a rest.
In the first phase, the small force that had advanced fell back on Isurava, where it linked with regular Australian troops. Still heavily outnumbered, the Australians, after several days, fell back again to stand on Efoghi. Part of the Australian force was cut off here by a Japanese flanking move and was isolated for 2 weeks. By September 10th, the withdrawal had reached Ioribaiwa, where it was strengthened by further Australian troops advancing out of Moresby. This force held the Japanese for a week, then withdrew to a strong defensive position on Imita Ridge, 50 kilometers from Moresby. This placed the Australians at the end of a manageable supply line and extended the Japanese lines of communication in a place where distance was not the issue. Porters and mules brought up supplies. The Japanese, with their typical shortage of support elements, were soon suffering terribly, lacking food, enfeebled, and racked by disease.
I've heard New Guinea described as the foulest terrain that was encountered by troops in the Second World War. Essentially, you have 10 days worth of travel over a series of mountains. It ascends and descends 5,000 metres, which when you look at it is more than that you would actually climb from the Everest base camp to the Everest summit. And then you consider that they're doing that in heat while they're being afflicted by leeches, mosquitoes, they're ravened with dysentery. That's a lot to contend with, let alone thinking about the fact that you're also fighting a war and being shot at.
For every man wounded on the Kokoda track, 7 were incapacitated by sickness. Bearers bringing supplies to the front line, a trek of 8 days, necessarily consumed half the supplies on the journey.
Australians bring up their artillery. And please remember that the temperature is round about 90 in the shade, a wet, steamy heat at that.
You need to remember, these guys are in their late teens, early to mid-20s. They've been in the military for months. They're probably at the peak of their fitness. And soldiers themselves talk about how exhausting the terrain was. We know that soldiers, particularly during the second part of the campaign, as they move forward, they start to jettison their equipment. Basically, they stripped down, so all they really had was a shirt and their shorts. Everything was done to strip down, to minimise your weight, because you just want to save what energy you have to go forward.
As the Australians began their move back along the track, the Japanese facing them could not expect relief. The attempted landing at Milne Bay had been repulsed, and the commitment to Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands denied the force in the Owen Stanleys any hope of reinforcement. Towards the end of September, now coming under pressure from relatively fresh Australian troops, the Japanese began their own fighting withdrawal. Rearguards were skillfully deployed along the track, and it took bitter fighting, firing sometimes at shadows in the jungle, locking sometimes in hand-to-hand combat at Templeton's Crossing and then Eora Creek, before Kokoda was retaken.
It's very hard to appreciate how claustrophobic jungle warfare is when you can't see the enemy, all you can hear is noises, and you think, was that a Japanese soldier, or is it a wild pig? Is it one of my mates who's got lost? I can't see him, can he see me? So terrain is key, that sense of atmosphere and place.
The toll was horrific. More than 150,000 Japanese troops served in New Guinea. Barely 6% of them survived. What was left of the Japanese force made a last stand at Oivi, east of Kokoda, before retiring to the coast. The fighting moved towards the sea, and on January 2nd, 1943, almost 6 months after Maroubra force had first set off to cross the Kokoda track, its objective, Buna, fell to the Allies. The success at Kokoda, as any success will, boosted morale and hardened the troops for the battles ahead.
Every victory has been the result of tremendous effort, great endurance, and supreme individual courage. A real beginning has been made in driving the Japs back from the fringe of their Pacific conquests. A solid foundation for the shape of things to come.
Woods and water in the land of the midnight sun and the 1,000 lakes. But at the end of a year, very little sun, temperatures to -40 and more than a metre of snow. This was the landscape into which the Red Army thrust, not as part of the World War, but as a cynical land grab, taking the opportunity of the universal preoccupation with the main battlefield to redefine its border with Finland.
Finland had been part of the Russian Empire, and Stalin's Soviet Union thought that it had dibs, and in the winter of 1939-40 invaded Finland, hoping to snatch some easy territory. Didn't turn out that way, though.
Soviet forces invaded Finland on November 30th, 1939. The assault by the 13th Army over the Karelian Isthmus faltered against the Mannerheim line.
That the Reds were repulsed. They're said to have left over 8,000 dead on the frozen battlefield near Summa in the south in the course of an 8-day attempt to break the Mannerheim line.
Further north, 5 divisions of the Soviet 9th Army were met by small units that ultimately formed into a single Finnish division, the 9th, at a place called Suomussalmi. These troops were not strong enough to prevent Russian occupation of Suomussalmi village, though the withdrawing Finns had burned it as they had destroyed bridges to slow the Russian advance.
All huts and farm buildings are destroyed by fire, so that the unfortunate Soviet troops can find no shelter from the terrible Arctic weather, and death by freezing has caused quite a big proportion of their losses.
With Suomussalmi in Russian hands, the first stage of the battle ended. The Finnish troops were assembled on the southern bank of the Chianti Lake and were brought under fire on December 9th by an assault supported by artillery and grenade launchers. The Russian tanks could not support the attack. The ice was thick enough for men, but it was too early in the winter for the tanks to safely cross. This was the first evidence that the Red Army had not properly anticipated the conditions on the battlefield.
The weather was Arctic. There was a metre of snow across the ground. The Russians, you'd think, would be used to those conditions, in fact weren't. They were colossally underprepared.
The 27th Infantry Regiment attacked from the east. Its target, the southern part of the village. Finnish units pressed forward until, after 2 weeks of fighting, Soviet forces left Suomussalmi and withdrew across the ice of Lake Chianti. With Suomussalmi back in Finnish hands, Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo, commanding, put everything he had into dislodging the Russians from the vital Rata Road area. His plan was to cut the supply route that reached over the border and kept the Red Army in the field. Silasvuo ordered a road cleared across the frozen lakes, parallel to the Rata Road. In early January, he unleashed his assembled force. The Finns were equipped, white-suited in the snow. Units of them ski troops, all of them winter-proofed.
The Finns continue to defend their country against the Russian aggressor with the greatest valor and tenacity. The Russian dead cannot yet be counted, but scenes like this are to be found over many miles of the front.
The Red Army Command had made the mistake that the Germans would make in Russia, thinking that a quick victory would come before the bitter cold took its toll. The fighting quality of the Red Army was also compromised by the brutality of Stalin's paranoid purges, which had stripped the military of 36,000 of its best officers.
And that cast a pall. It grossly undermined the morale of Russian commanders, and that malaise penetrated through their units.
The 163rd Division was destroyed, and the Rata Road was cut, meaning resupply and reinforcement was not possible. The climax would be the battle to evict the Soviet force from Rata, forcing them back towards and over the border. Facing the Finns was the elite motorized 44th Division.
The Russian forces were immensely superior to the Finnish forces, which were very lightly equipped. The Russians advanced in long mechanized columns through the Finnish forests, covered in snow, ice-covered lakes. And that was their weakness, because the Finns, who were very lightly equipped and moved on skis, descended on the Russian columns, cut them off and cut them to pieces, a tactic that the Finns called moti, which means piling up wood in the forests, which is what they did to the Russians.
Between the 5th and 7th of January, the 44th was destroyed, and the Battle of Suomussalmi was over. When, in March, a peace treaty ended the Russo-Finnish War, the situation in Suomussalmi was unchanged, with the Finns continuing to occupy the village and the road. Their victory, a victory for morale, motivation, tactics and terrain, had cost the Soviet Union 27,500 killed or frozen to death, 50 tanks destroyed, and vast quantities of equipment lost and broken.
Suomussalmi, although it was a tactical victory, didn't help the outcome of the war, because when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, it brought Finland in as its ally. Finns were eager to regain their territory and to exact revenge on the Soviets, but it got caught up in this terrible Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union.
On November 8, 1942, an American force sailing from the USA started to disembark troops in Morocco.
The many beaches selected for the landings ranged from the western corner of Morocco to places hundreds of miles east, beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, beyond Algiers.
It was part of the complex operation to land on the western edge of North Africa and move east, to effect a link-up with the 8th Army moving west after its success at El Alamein.
Many landings were actually or almost entirely unopposed.
The campaign was known as Operation Torch, and early in its unfolding, American and German troops met in battle for the first time, when two Axis army groups, one under General von Arnim, the other Erwin Rommel, moved forward to meet them. On February 14th, von Arnim launched Operation Springwind, attacking and taking Sidi Bouzid after a day-long fight. During the action, American operations were hampered by weak command decisions and poor use of armor. On the 15th, Rommel launched his offensive, Operation Morning Wind, destroying 40 American tanks during the first day of operations. He pushed on to Sbitla. General Fredendall, a controversial commander who never visited the front, pulled his force back to the Kasserine Pass. Linking with 10th Panzer Division from von Arnim's command, Rommel assaulted the new position on the 19th, smashing into the Allied lines and compelling US troops to withdraw. Rommel personally led the 10th Panzer Division into the Kasserine and ordered 21st Panzer Division to press through the Sbiba Gap. This move was effectively blocked by an Allied force centered on the British 6th Armoured, US 1st and 34th Infantry Divisions. fighting around Kasserine revealed serious deficiencies in Allied armour, the superiority of German panzers quickly defeating US M3 Lee and M3 Stuart tanks. Exiting the pass, Rommel divided 10th Panzer to press north towards Thala and west towards Tebessa, which he never reached. By the night of February 21st, Rommel stood outside Thala and believed that the Allied supply base at Tebessa on the railway line was within reach. But the Allied lines at Thala had been reinforced by British infantry backed by US artillery, and the position occupied on the 22nd was the limit of the German advance.
The enemy's resistance, though resolute, was eventually broken here, and there was plenty of evidence by the wayside as our advance continued.
Rommel, unable to break through, elected to end the battle in order to reinforce the Mareth line, the position that could prevent Montgomery, advancing west, from breaking through and linking up with the forces that had landed as part of Operation Torch.
Finally, the withdrawal of the enemy tank force. Just one isolated incident in the combined Allied effort to drive Rommel and co. into the sea.
Allied forces reoccupied Kasserine Pass on February 25th. The first major clash between American and German forces, the battle showed an enemy superiority, not just in some materiel, but predictably in experience. It also exposed flaws in the American command structure and doctrine. The American response to what was more a debacle than a battle lost was to initiate several changes, including the immediate removal of the incompetent Fredendall. Command of 2nd Corps famously passed to Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Patton was controversial. His disciplinary methods got him into trouble, and his pistol-packing ways had their critics. But he was a fighting general, and with the Allies on the attack, an aggressive, fighting disposition was required. Patton drove his troops from Africa into Sicily and out of the Normandy beachhead, rallied them at the Battle of the Bulge, and earned and loved the nickname Old Blood and Guts. In terrain as difficult as any fought over, and conditions as harsh as any that soldiers had to endure, the Burma Campaign went on month after long month of thrust and counter-thrust.
The first half of 1944 is dominated by the Japanese attempt to invade India. They're halted just over the border, and there the Japanese suffer the biggest defeats in their military history. They leave 50,000 dead on the battlefield. That's their high watermark. Then they pull back.
At last, towards the end of 1944, with Allied troops beginning to be strengthened, with the tide turned in Europe, and with Japanese resources threadbare, the operation to expel Japanese troops from Burma gained momentum. Two operations were designed to expel the Japanese from Burma. Capital, in which Slim's 14th Army would advance from Assam across the Chinwin to re-establish contact with the nationalist Chinese, and Dracula, a combined airborne, land, and amphibious assault on Rangoon.
The 14th Army and the Burma Theatre were at the bottom of British priorities. The Mediterranean, Europe and the home front took priority. So it had very few resources. It fought on scales of transport and other administrative elements that would have been unacceptable in other theatres. The next thing that Slim did, and which is critical in this campaign, is raise the morale and confidence in 14th Army to fever pitch.
General Slim, commander of the 14th Army, has some heartening news of the war against Japan.
Nothing can stop us winning, but a great deal can be done to speed up and render less costly the final victory.
The 14th Army called itself the Forgotten Army, and Slim seized on that and made the Forgotten Army something to be proud of.
In early November, the Chinese 6th Army began to move. Operation Capital was launched on December 3rd, with the 11th East African and 19th and 20th Indian Divisions crossing the Chinwind. A few days later, the Chinese First Army was coming south towards the British line of advance and took Bamo. General Kimura, commanding Japan's Burma Area Army, was in a desperate situation. He had little prospect of resupply and was obliged to marshal what he had with great care. So he fell back before the initial advance, offering token resistance. The lack of defense encouraged Slim to change the plan. Operation Extended Capital was more ambitious.
His generalship was superb. He convinced the Japanese that he was going to throw everything at Mandalay. Naturally, they deployed the bulk of their forces to protect Mandalay, it being a very important communications hub for them. But then, through an elaborate deception plan, Slim deployed an entire corps about 100 kilometres south, where they crossed the Irrawaddy and then headed another 80 kilometres to take Maitila, through which all the Japanese communications to Mandalay and further north passed.
The Japanese were repositioning their defences for the battle for Mandalay, so West African and Indian advances in the Arakan and 15th Corps hook along the coast to Ramri were largely unopposed.
A war of patrol activity in which the Bren carrier scouts along the coast.
On January 7th, the Japanese 15th Army withdrew across the Irrawaddy. By mid-January, the 19th Indian Division had established a bridgehead across the Irrawaddy. At the end of the month, the Burma and Ledo roads were joined at Mongyu, with the Chinese First Army striking south along the Burma Road and the 6th striking southeast from Bamo.
These Chinese units have been attacking Japanese positions guarding the Burma Road, and they've been making progress.
Fourth Corps pressed south, initiating the battle for Maitila, which fell to the 17th Indian Division. Their supply route was then cut by a Japanese counterattack. And the veteran 17th, continuously in the field for longer than any other unit in the British Army, had to rely on airdropped supplies while repelling repeated attempts by the Japanese 33rd Army to take Maitila's airfields. The 33rd's commander, General Maski Hinda, was forced to order a withdrawal on March 28th. 19th Indian Division had reached the outskirts of Mandalay on the 9th, with most of the city cleared by the 11th, as 2nd British Division advanced from the west. The focus now turned to Rangoon, which would be assaulted by a combined operation codenamed Dracula. 17th Indian was advancing south along the line of the Sitang, reaching Pegu on April 29th. By then, the first promise of the monsoon, the so-called mango rains, were falling.
The monsoon made campaigning in Burma impossible for 6 months of the year, and life was miserable at that time. And the Japanese, with their long lines of communication, primitive transport, not having control of the air, couldn't keep their troops supplied. At least Slim could. Many of the Japanese in Burma simply starved.
Despite the weather, it was decided to go ahead with the combined Allied assault on the capital. On May 1st, a Gurkha parachute battalion dropped on Elephant Point at the mouth of the Irrawaddy. And the next day, the 26th Indian Division carried the amphibious assault. They linked with the 17th advancing from Pegu on the 6th. But the Japanese had withdrawn towards the Thai border. By the beginning of August, the last Japanese had left Burma, but they were not pursued.
The victory in Burma did restore some measure of British respect, but it was too late because the earlier defeats in Burma, and especially in Malaya and Singapore, had been a stimulus to nascent nationalist movements, and they bore fruit in the independence granted to both India and Burma after the war.
The greatest defence against the U-boat has been the unfailing courage of the men who bring supplies across the sea in the face of every risk of war and weather.
Through the summer months, the Arctic ports of Murmansk and Archangel in the White Sea were vital entry points for Allied supplies being sent to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease arrangement.
When the Soviet Union entered the war, the Western Allies immediately agreed to send as much support as they could to the Soviet Union. And that meant going either the southern way through Persia, which is the long way round, or the cold way through the Arctic Sea, around the top of Norway. And now this sounds like a really disastrous way to go about supplying the Soviet Union, but in fact it worked. 103 ships went through 1941-42, and only one of those ships was sunk. So Arctic convoys actually worked. But in July 1942, the Arctic convoy system fell to pieces.
39 convoys travelled to the North Russian ports, and of 533 escorted merchant vessels, only 69 were lost to enemy action. And most of those losses were taken by PQ-17, the designation of the convoy that suffered more than any other anywhere in the war. PQ-17, the initials were merely those of the man who chartered the original convoy route, sailed from Hvalfjordur in Iceland on June 27th.
It was a very big convoy, escorted by many warships, and of course every man aboard every ship knew pretty well what lay ahead. Attack by U-boat, by bomber and torpedo bomber.
It was the first Anglo-American convoy to sail under British command. It comprised 35 merchantmen carrying 297 aircraft, 594 tanks, 4,246 trucks and gun carriers, and a further 156,000 tons of cargo, sufficient to equip an army of 50,000 men. In the values of the day, the cargo was worth an estimated $700 million. The escort comprised 4 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 2 submarines, as well as a pair of tankers to refuel the vessels as required. Shortly after sailing, one ship ran aground and had to return to Iceland. On June 29th, the convoy encountered heavy ice, damaging 4 ships, one of which was given permission to turn back. 33 ships sailed on. On July 1st, they were located by German forces. The British Admiralty was also monitoring PQ-17, and on learning that German ships, including the battleship Tirpitz, were moving to intercept, ordered the escort to break off to hunt the German raiders. And in view of the removal of the covering force, the convoy was ordered to scatter in an Admiralty order sent by Admiral Dudley Pound at 21:23 on July 4th. Followed at 21:36 by a simple, unambiguous order: convoy is to scatter.
The turning point for PQ-17 comes on the evening of the 4th of July, when the British, from the Admiralty, this isn't a local decision, it's an Admiralty decision for the convoy to scatter, literally deserting those merchant ships and making them find their own way to Soviet ports. They're only halfway through the voyage at this point, and it leaves them at the mercy of the Germans.
When the order came, the convoy had covered a little over half of its journey. Spread across the ocean, it would be far more difficult for a battleship to target. But the Tirpitz played no part. No surface raider did. But U-boats and the Luftwaffe fell on the scattered and undefended vessels through the long daylight hours of the northern summer. The messages from the isolated ships have been preserved and being bombed, on fire. 6 U-boats approaching on the surface, abandoning ship. On July 15th, 6 merchantmen were sent to the bottom by the Luftwaffe. And 6 more by U-boats. 2 more on the 6th, 5 the next day, and 2 more, the final 2, on the 10th. Churchill called it a melancholy naval episode. It was rather more than that. Of the 33 ships that had sailed on without escort, 23 had been sunk and more than 150 lives lost. 180,000 tons of war material had been loaded in Iceland. 64,000 tons were delivered. Supply via the Arctic route was temporarily suspended, not resuming until September, when much stronger escort arrangements were in place.
The convoy system was actually a work of genius. I mean, the British tried it in the Napoleonic Wars and realized 100 years before that it was a success. If you went in a convoy, you could get through. In the First World War, they proved it again.
As in the last war, so in this, the convoy system has proved its efficiency.
So convoys should be a way of getting supplies to where you need them in a safe way. And indeed, that's exactly what they proved in just about every other theatre of the war.
We attack with depth charges. Now for the explosion. The submarine, crippled by depth charges, is forced to surface.
PQ-17 is different. PQ-17, because of this panic, I mean, you can only describe it as a mark of panic on the part of Dudley Pound, where he abandons the convoy. It proves that convoys work because PQ-17 doesn't. But why does he abandon them? And it's a mark of just how fearsome the German pocket battleships were. You know, these commerce raiders, which they'd sunk most of during the war, but the Tirpitz remained. And what Dudley Pound didn't want was for American cruisers to be sunk by the Tirpitz. And that's the reason, I think, why PQ-17 was abandoned to its fate.
The offensive launched against Russia in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, was without parallel in the history of war. Along a massive front, an armed mass of more than 1 million men, machines, tanks, aircraft, of 650,000 horses, swept into and through the Soviet heartland. But Barbarossa did not drive for the capital. After Smolensk fell in August, German troops turned north and south.
There's a strategic dispute between Hitler and the generals in July and August 1941, in which the generals are unambiguously geared toward seizing Moscow. Hitler does not want to do this. He opts for the Battle of Kiev. But 2 weeks into the Battle of Kiev, so early September, Hitler issues a war directive stating that after he has taken the eastern parts of the Ukraine, there will be a major new offensive directed toward Moscow.
When it came, it was designated Operation Typhoon. The Germans planned a giant pincer movement, closing north and south to grip the capital. 3rd and 4th Panzer armies would move against the Kalinin front and cut the Moscow-Leningrad railway. 2nd Panzer Army would move in the south, and 4th Army would move from the west, directly on Moscow.
It was like the same pattern as Barbarossa, so we're making these enormous encirclements and cutting them into 2 or 3 salients and then destroying them separately. And then the pathway to Moscow must be open.
The numbers finally involved were staggering. Towards 2 million Axis, with over 1,000 tanks and 500 aircraft. In the end, more than 2 million Soviet troops, 3,000 tanks, and more than 1,000 aircraft. But before the Soviet command could bring up reserves and reach those figures, the Germans enjoyed superiority. And at the start of Operation Typhoon, success. In their drive, 4th Panzer and 2nd Panzer quickly isolated pockets at Vyazma and Bryansk, respectively, that trapped Red Army formations. When the Bryansk pocket surrendered on October 14th, 50,000 prisoners were taken. Many Soviet troops managed to escape. 5 days later, the Vyazma pocket was eliminated, and here 670,000 prisoners marched into cruel captivity that would cost many their lives.
In many ways, one of the fascinating things about the Eastern Front is just the enormity, the frightening enormity of the losses on both sides, but especially on the Soviet side in 1941. So these catastrophic losses are sustained. At that point, Germany, this is a real reflection of its hubris, is pronouncing the war is won.
The soldiers are reading the newspapers on the front line and they're shocked because that's not what they see. Yes, the Red Army, they've lost a lot of people, but they're still sending in new troops. They're still sending in people, so they have more resources, and it's so obvious that the Germans cannot hold on. Yes, they can push on, but at what cost?
In early October, the first rains fell. Before long, liquid mud was slowing the advance. But by the 13th of October, German troops reached the fortifications thrown up to protect Moscow's western approaches, the Mozhaisk line. Zhukov had by now been placed in command of the defense, and he pulled troops back and concentrated them at key strong points. This weakened the Mozhaisk line, which fell on October 18th. No line existed to hold up the advance in the south, but bad weather and bad roads did. Tula was not reached until October 26th. The German invasion was moving. It was moving slowly, but it was moving inexorably. It was winning and would soon be at the gates of Moscow. But by late October, 2/3 of the German motor pool was out of action. Fuel supply problems were chronic and casualties were mounting. To rectify the deficiencies, from the end of October until November 15th, the High Command ordered a pause.
The city of Tula, about 100 miles due south of the capital, was almost surrounded. But this important factory town held out, and the workers of Tula carried on with their munition making to the very last minute possible.
What's interesting and what is also reflective of National Socialist military thinking is the Germans themselves know that this 2-week pause benefits the enemy more than it benefits themselves. So even though they know they need this time to bring up more supplies, more offensive capacity, they're also aware the Soviets are benefiting even more, and that doesn't stop them from attempting Typhoon 2 in the middle of November when the weather is even colder. This is going to be a frontal advance, really sending their men into the teeth of Soviet defenses. If this strikes you as a bad idea, you're right, it is a bad idea.
On November 15th, German tank armies moved, restoring the pincer, squeezing in on Moscow. Klin fell on November 24th. By the 28th, panzers had a bridgehead over the Moscow-Volga Canal. But the First Shock Army drove them back with a counterattack. German units now stood less than 30 kilometers from their objective, and German officers surveyed the onion turrets of Moscow through their field glasses. And then, the most ferocious Russian of all entered the field.
General Winter, though we were warned not to rely upon his aid too much, is already proving a powerful ally, and the Red Army makes full use of the alliance.
On November 30th, General von Bock reported to Berlin that the temperature was minus 45 degrees Celsius, and that tanks would not start, lubricants were frozen, soldiers in summer uniforms were dying, and frostbite was being seen. On December 2nd, a Wehrmacht reconnaissance battalion reached Khimki, less than 20 kilometers from the Kremlin. And that was as far as Typhoon got.
German forces are overextended, they are exhausted, they are at the end of very tenuous supply lines, and they have absolutely no idea of what's coming. The offensive from the Soviets will begin on the evening of the 5th, and the Germans will then begin a massive withdrawal, both in the north of Moscow and towards the south around Tula. This retreat will be catastrophic for the Germans.
It's only a few weeks ago that the German advance on the Eastern Front had reached the very outskirts of Moscow itself. Only a few weeks ago, Hitler's intuition told him Moscow would fall. Certainly things did look pretty black for Russia and for us.
The battle for Moscow was over. And for the Germans, the battle to hold ground and survive had begun.
There is no path to German success. Economically, they are falling behind. Militarily, they haven't got their operational edge, and they can't get it back. So while the German army still exists in being, while it still occupies the Eastern Front, and while it still has got men and artillery and tanks, and sometimes impressive numbers, it's not able to ever end the war, and unless Hitler's looking for a political solution, which is not possible for him, he sees this war ending only in victory or utter total defeat, and that's what's going to happen.
Every battle is both a victory and a defeat. It depends which flag you fly. In every theater of the Second World War, battles won and lost determined possession of territory, of resources, and of the strength to go on fighting. For some of the battles, it was the victory that most influenced the future course of the war. For others, it was the defeat. This is the story of the battles won and lost that decided the outcome of the greatest conflict in history. Some words transcend their origins as humble place names, even as the names given to battles won and lost. They are carved into history as turning points which influenced the course of the war, the fate of nations, the makeup of our world. These words are indestructible. El Alamein, Okinawa, Pearl Harbor.
Well, Pearl Harbor was put together quite late. The Japanese had to acquire raw materials from Southeast Asia following an American embargo in July 1941. The objective was to seize quickly key points in Southeast Asia, but in order to do it, they had to bypass the Philippines. Pearl Harbor was the key. Knock out the fleet, the battleships, and they assumed carriers located at Pearl Harbor so that they would then be free at the same time to invade Malaya, to seize Southeast Asia.
It was done in the understanding that in the long term, the Americans had the capacity to build up sufficient military power to create a terrible threat to Japan. But it was done in the hope that Japan could achieve sufficient success that the Americans would feel it wasn't worthwhile going on.
From carriers 370 kilometers out in the Pacific, the Japanese had launched pre-dawn. The first waves fell on Pearl Harbor at 7:40 a.m. In that first attack, 40 torpedo bombers, 49 high-level bombers, 41 dive bombers, and 43 fighters swept around the west of the island of Oahu to hook up into the great naval base, the natural harbor in the south of the island. The first attack lasted for 30 minutes.
We were thinking about the Army Air Force. They used to have maneuvers on Sunday mornings. We said that they're kind of early this morning. Then pretty soon we saw a bomb drop.
Out of a clear sky came the treacherous Japanese attack on Hawaii. The whole world knows now how Japan assaulted the American naval base without warning, without a declaration of war, and while her envoys were actually negotiating in Washington.
In addition to anchorages, the first attack had targeted air bases: Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, Kaneohe, and Ewa, grounding any possible opposition to the second raid. There were 354 American aircraft on the island, of which 188 were destroyed and 159 damaged. 7 escaped unscathed. At 8:50 a.m., the second wave hooked in from the opposite side of the island and pounded its targets for more than an hour. The force comprised 54 high-level bombers and 78 dive bombers with fighter support. The defenders had organized their anti-aircraft fire by this time.
And we went up to our battle stations and fired at planes coming over. And it went on for a couple hours.
Of the 29 Japanese aircraft lost in the raid, 20 were in the second wave.
There's no question that it would have been worthwhile for the Japanese to attempt another attack. And they should have been going for the oil tanks and for the dockyard facilities in order to reduce the capacity of Pearl Harbor to be the base in the Pacific from which the Americans could then mount their further attacks.
They did not have enough screening vessels, and had they not so much launched a third strike, had they stayed in the area, they probably would have netted the Enterprise, which was nearby. So they had the forces there, but they were very worried about being so far out, lacking screening vessels, that they pulled away a bit too early.
94 warships were in the harbour. 18 were sunk or suffered serious damage. But of the 5 battleships that were sunk, 3 were to return to service. One that did not, and remains today as a memorial to the date that will live in infamy, was the Arizona. 4 out of every 5 men aboard the Arizona were killed. 1,100 out of the 2,403 American fatalities on that day.
A lot of the guys were caught in fires and jumped over the side. Some of them drowned, some of them burned to death, some of them. But I was one of the lucky ones in that case, though.
As a mathematical statement, Pearl Harbor was a battle lost for the Americans. But the port's infrastructure was largely intact, and there were no carriers in Pearl Harbor when the attack came in.
The operation was a partial tactical success, with the caveat that the wrong targets were attacked. It was a strategic failure of the worst order, and Yamamoto's comment that he feared the sleeping giant had been awakened, I think was a correct one. The nature of that attack was the thing most calculated to create in the United States a collective will to respond in a way that I don't think anything else would have.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
On the 12th of August 1943, Hitler ordered construction of a new defensive line on the Eastern Front, the East Wall. But he forbade any thought of withdrawal to the position. So, as autumn began to be felt, Axis forces stood as much as 300 kilometers ahead of the wall, which was itself well inside Russian territory. On August 26th, the Red Army began its autumn offensive. By Christmas, when winter closed down fighting, the German front had been pushed back all along its length, and in the center, as much as 150 kilometers behind the East Wall. The Central Front, Rokossovsky, moved beyond the battlefield of Kursk. At the same time, Army Group South, von Manstein, was coming under pressure from the 3rd and 4th Ukrainian fronts. When Hitler visited von Manstein's headquarters on the 27th, he was called on to decide whether to reinforce Army Group South with formations from the center or permit a withdrawal behind the line of the Dnieper. He couldn't decide. When he went on to visit von Kluge at Group Center HQ, he was persuaded not to reinforce von Manstein. 4th Ukrainian Front, Tolbuchen, liberated Taganrog 2 days later, and momentum was all with the advancing Russian forces. On September 2nd, Central Front reached the Bryansk-Konotop Railway, completing their break-in to the German line. A week into September, and the Caucasus Front moved on the Taman Peninsula. On the 10th, they took Mariupol by amphibious assault. And on the 14th, Central Front, with Voronezh Front, General Vatutin in support, began driving for Kiev. Towns were now being reclaimed on an almost daily basis. Bryansk on the 10th, and when Chernigov fell on the 21st, it signaled that Rokossovsky had reached the Dnieper.
At the moment, the best news comes from the Russian front, where the Red Army has been scoring one triumph after another, beating back the invaders, smashing their defenses.
On the 22nd, Vatutin's front began to cross the Dnieper.
General Vatutin, commanding the 1st Ukrainian Army, drives on beyond the Dnieper on a wide front.
Malinovsky's command crossing further south on the 26th, by which time Smolensk and Roslavi had fallen. At the beginning of October, the Baltic fronts of Yeremenko and Popov joined the offensive. By now, Manstein was back behind the east wall, but his forces were much reduced and he would have trouble holding the position. The momentum did not relent. And at the beginning of November, the Red Army launched a major assault out of its bridgehead over the Dnieper at Leyte. On November 6th, Kiev fell to the Red Army. And when, 6 days later, Zhytomyr fell, two fronts were able to combine in establishing a bridgehead of 160 by 240 kilometers, completely negating the utility, indeed the very idea, of the East Wall.
The scale of the Soviet comeback is without parallel in military history. With the Allies poised for attack in the west, the Red Army blasts and batters the German barbarians in the east.
As campaigning stalled with winter, the German armies were still intact, and they were still wholly on Russian soil. But the Soviet forces had advanced to a much stronger position from which to launch first the spring and then the epic summer offensive. Operation Bagration. When General Montgomery was appointed to command the 8th Army, he made one thing clear. He would not go onto the offensive until he had total materiel superiority. And he withstood Churchill's impatience until he was satisfied that the odds were right. And then he orchestrated the Second Battle of El Alamein.
Second Alamein is very much a set-piece battle. Montgomery emphasised that the troops shall be trained in the tasks that they are meant to do. So you had some battalion and brigade commanders building replicas of the positions that they were going to attack and training and rehearsing their role for weeks and weeks and weeks beforehand.
General Montgomery, realising that a citizen army fights best when it knows exactly what's going on and what it is going to do, saw to it that the plan of battle was known to everybody, from general to private soldier.
The battle had, in a sense, begun as another battle, the one initiated by Rommel on the night of the 30th of August on the 8th Army's position at Alam Halfa, targeting the weak southern end of the British line that ran about 65 kilometers from the sea to the Katara Depression. There was some desperation in Rommel's plan. Of the 6 supply ships on which he had been depending, 4 had been sunk. His success now depending, in part, on the successful capture of British fuel dumps during his advance, or his armour would be stranded. Within 3 days, blocked by well-prepared defensive positions, Rommel was forced back on his start line.
By Second Alamein, the balance of material and troops and logistics in the Middle East had tipped. This is the first major battle where the British forces exceed those of the Germans in all regards, in terms of air power, in terms of men, in terms of anti-tank guns, in terms of medium tanks. Montgomery has assembled his forces and he's massed them ready for this attack to break through the line.
On the night of the 23rd of October, 900 guns opened their throats. And the Battle of El Alamein was underway.
The poor Germans, I said, they got it. So Montgomery, he opened up with over 1,000 pieces of artillery on that Alamein line. It came over like hailstones.
North to south from the coast to the Katara, Montgomery deployed a truly Commonwealth force. 9th Australian Division at the Coast Road, the 51st Highland Division, 2nd New Zealand and 1st South African, then 4th Indian and further south, 50th and 44th Divisions and Free French, with 3 armoured divisions in support. 2nd New Zealand was the first advancing force to claim its first objective. It secured Materia Ridge, but 10th Armoured in support did not exploit the chance to break out. North of them, 9th Australia was slowed, passing through a minefield, with 1st Armoured hanging behind them. All this while, Rommel was away. He had gone to Germany on sick leave. On the 25th, he returned to his command, and to find that along the line from the British 13th Corps in the south to the intended main break-in in the north, the attackers had been checked and progress slowed.
The resistance along the Alamein line was very strong. The British and Commonwealth forces were not able to break through. Montgomery's battle plan was delayed, and essentially it had to be reset.
Rommel launched armour to recover ground lost at Materia and Kidney Ridges, but was beaten back. Montgomery concluded from the progress of the battle that the main German concentration was in the north, facing the troops that he had charged with making the breakthrough. He responded by realigning the major thrust. This would now come south of the coastal sector in a new plan, Supercharge, where its principal opposition would be the Italian formations. 9th Australian was to continue pressure on the coast road, but the main line of attack would now be inland and westwards. Supercharge and the breakthrough began in the middle of the night of the 1st of November. 2nd New Zealand led the attack, supported by 1st Armoured Division, which took a heavy toll of 15th Panzer, which engaged it. Success was consolidated on November 3rd, when 4th Indian and the 51st were sent in against Kidney Hill. Their breakthrough opened the road for 7th and 10th Armoured, which raced through into open country.
I can remember there was one tank sitting out in front burning, one of ours, and there's a voice in my ear saying, "Help, help me." The operator on that tank had been on the wireless when his tank was hit, and somebody was trapped in that tank. The wireless was still on. God's sake, help me. And one of our tanks put a shot through the side of it and the voice stopped.
When 1st Armoured and the New Zealand Division joined the offensive, the Italian Ariete Division was almost completely destroyed. Rommel was on the back foot all along the line. South 13th Corps under General Horrocks overran the Italian formations facing it. And the entire Axis line was now falling back as Rommel began his withdrawal along the coast. By escaping, even if only to be pursued all along the North African littoral, Rommel had avoided the total defeat for which Montgomery hoped.
If there's a criticism to be laid at this point in time, it's of the timidity of the Allied follow-up. But we also have to remember that a lot of Montgomery's units had fought themselves to a near standstill, breaking through at Alamein, that his armoured forces were starting to feel the toll of battle, that particularly the Australian division, it had been hammered in its fight to the north, so the capacity of Montgomery's forces to chase was quite limited as well.
But by any assessment, Rommel had suffered a decisive loss. And the Allies, for the first time in the war, could celebrate a decisive victory.
After Alamein, the Germans essentially are on their way out of North Africa. Dealing with North Africa starts the Allies thinking about their re-entry into Western Europe. And in many ways, it's the turning point in the war for the Western forces.
Germans have received back again that measure of fire and steel which they have so often meted out to others. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
When the wars of East and West were joined by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the longest battle of the Second World War was already over 2 years old. It was known as the Battle of the Atlantic and it started as the war in Europe began, with the Atlantic remaining a battlefield until the very last days of the war.
It was the vital logistic battle of the war. Whether it failed or succeeded on either side really determined the course of the war, and how well it was going profoundly influenced what each side could be doing in other campaigns.
There were periods in the first years of the war. The German U-boat commanders dubbed them the happy times, when it seemed as though the Battle of the Atlantic could decide the war, and decide it in favour of the Axis powers. But the tide of battle turned in the first half of 1943, after which it was clear that the Allies had control. The basis of Britain's imperial power had always been importing raw materials from and exporting manufactured goods to her colonies and dominions. This had made the United Kingdom more than usually dependent on imports for survival, and those imports must ultimately join one of the Atlantic sea lanes. After the fall of France, German aircraft, surface ships and submarines were based along the French Atlantic coast. From the airfields and ports of the French coast, their efforts to disrupt and destroy Britain's vital maritime lifeline became the Battle of the Atlantic. Germany's glamorous surface vessels, such as the Bismarck, Graf Spee, Scharnhorst and Tirpitz, took a toll. But each was picked off in turn by the Royal Navy. Aircraft sank ships, but not in numbers that would have forced the British Isles to its knees. The real threat was the submarine.
The advantage the submarine has as a commerce raider, I think, was paramount. The submarines could attack unseen, were very difficult to detect. Once detected, were good at evading and could come and re-attack. The Germans also set up a pretty sophisticated system for working out where the targets were and for concentrating the U-boats to do mass attacks.
Lessons learned in the First World War meant that from the outset, merchant ships travelled in convoys. Admiral Dönitz, commanding the submarine fleet, evolved a tactic to counter the convoy system. Rudeltaktik, which came to be called the Wolf Pack. It worked.
With the U-boats hunting in packs, extra vigilance by the convoys is essential to their safety.
Dönitz never had as many submarines as he wanted, but then the Allies did not initially have as many escorts as they wanted. And for the first years of the war, there was a gap in the air cover where convoys sailed beyond the range of aircraft. As the battle wore on, tactics changed.
New weapons were developed which were much more effective at destroying the U-boats. It was a constant battle of offence versus defence and developing technology on both sides. Fundamentally, all these things, together with perhaps the most important, which was the provision of long-range aircraft and air support to the convoys, which created, as a totality, a system which was able to reduce the U-boat threat.
The decisive month was May 1943. To the Germans, this was Black May. German submarine losses had risen sharply in proportion to the number of Allied ships being sunk. In April, 39 ships had been lost, but at a cost to the Germans of 15 U-boats, an unsupportable rate. And then convoy ONS-5, designated a slow convoy, sailed. 43 merchant ships were escorted by 16 warships. And in the Atlantic, the convoy came under attack from a pack of U-boats variously assessed at between 30 and 40 strong. Their attack went in on the night of May 4th. A Canadian Air Force Catalina sank one U-boat, an escort ship another. And 12 of the merchantmen were sent to the bottom. On the 5th, the escort group was reinforced. On the night of the 6th, the pack attacked again. And 4 U-boats were sunk. No merchantmen were lost. It is sometimes difficult to pinpoint the turning point at which a drawn-out battle was decided, but here was one. Convoy SC-130, a week later, met similar success. 37 merchantmen with an 8-ship escort sailed into the danger zone, where they were picked up by U-boats on May 19th. That same day, the convoy was joined on station by Escort Group 1. 3 days later, the convoy entered British waters and Escort Group 1 detached. In that mid-Atlantic passage, the U-boat pack had come under constant aircraft and surface vessel attack. 4 submarines were sunk without loss to the convoy. In the first 3 weeks of May, 31 U-boats were sunk. The total would reach 41 by the end of the month, and Dönitz was forced to temporarily suspend operations in the North Atlantic. The losses were prodigious. 36,000 merchant seamen, the same number of Allied soldiers, not less than 30,000 German submariners. Thousands of vessels, hundreds of aircraft. But no battle had a more vital bearing on the war in Europe.
The Allies prevailing the Atlantic allowed the remainder of the war to be fought. So by enabling the logistics, enabling the North American industrial machine to provide all the resources that were needed to fight what was an industrial war, the Battle of the Atlantic was central.
With the Soviet Union coming under immense renewed pressure in the early summer of 1942, as well over 100 Axis divisions renewed their assault, Stalin demanded more of his allies.
Stalin wanted Churchill to open up a second front, but he just wasn't in a position to do that at the time. So Churchill reasoned that a major raid could be a kind of compromise. If they could take a significant port, that would show the Germans that they were vulnerable in that area. That would then force Hitler to redistribute some of his forces down to protect that part of Europe, which would in turn take some of the pressure off the Red Army and, importantly, show Stalin that Churchill was doing his part, that he was a willing partner and not just sitting back while Russian lives were being taken en masse.
The Allied forces came up with the idea of a cross-channel raid. A raid, by definition, means hit and run. This was not to be an attempt to gain a toehold, let alone launch an invasion. They would, it was said, gain useful intelligence about German coastal defences preparatory to launching a full-scale invasion at a later date.
There were also secondary objectives, and the RAF in particular were eager to see this as an opportunity to draw out the Luftwaffe, to have a ding-dong battle and hopefully give them a hard time. At this time, the new Spitfire Mark 9 had just come out, and so they were confident that they'd be able to give the Luftwaffe a run for their money.
Producers of British aircraft have already proved that they turn out the best planes in the world. Each new Spitfire bears witness to the great contribution of British design and workmanship.
The objective selected was Dieppe. It was, in its planning, known as Operation Rutter. In its execution, it was called Operation Jubilee. British Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery's Southeastern Command provided the troops for the operation and planned a frontal assault without heavy preliminary air bombardment. Under pressure from the Canadian government to ensure that Canadian troops saw action, the Canadian 2nd Division was selected for the main force. They would assault the town while British parachute units attacked German batteries on the headlands as a diversion. That never happened. Bad weather caused delays. Montgomery was sent to North Africa to find the 8th Army and fame. The code name was changed to Jubilee, and Lord Louis Mountbatten took over planning. The air bombardment on Dieppe was reduced for fear of French casualties. Destroyers were allocated to bombard the shore. It was judged that battleships were too vulnerable that close to the coast. The parachute operation on the flanks was cancelled. An intelligence on which planning was based was patchy and in some cases laughable. German gun positions dug into the sides of the headland cliffs were not spotted by air reconnaissance, and planners assessed the beach gradient and its suitability for tanks by scanning holiday snapshots. The Royal Marine Commando was to land in fast gunboats after the main force had gone in. They were to destroy the Dieppe dock installations and capture documents in a safe in the port office. The break-in was to be the special responsibility of a Marine who had been a burglar in civilian life. It has recently been suggested, as documents have been declassified, that their real objective was a new Enigma machine, which was defying British cryptanalysts. The naval intelligence officer planning that part of the raid was Ian Fleming, later to find fame as the author of the James Bond novels.
Now, is this true? Well, we certainly know that Ian Fleming was there at Dieppe. It was his only battle experience from World War II. So that is certainly true. We certainly know that it was a goal of the Dieppe Raid to gather intelligence, so that certainly fits. So it's very possible.
The Germans, alerted by French double agents that the British were targeting Dieppe, were on high alert.
It began with the Navy taking the Army across a calm channel in a dim light just before dawn. Navy, Army and RAF combining in a bigger raid than any attempted so far.
The raid began at 0450 on the 19th of August, with the faint remaining hope of surprise having been lost. The landing craft of the eastern sector had unexpectedly encountered a small German convoy. The resultant violent sea fight alerted the German coastal defences at Berneval and Puit. As the assault force approached the coast of France, the Germans were at action stations. 2 commando units made flanking landings, number 3 on Yellow Beach at the eastern end of the landing zone and number 4 on Orange Beach at the western end. The main force hit 3 beaches at and about the town and port of Dieppe. Blue to the east, green to the west, and the main force coming in on red and white beaches. Number 4 Commando successfully stormed the Varangeville battery and was the only unit to capture all of its objectives. Only 18 men from Number 3 Commando got ashore in the right place. They managed to distract the Berneval battery to good effect, but were eventually forced to withdraw as superior enemy forces responded to their landing. A concentrated naval bombardment preceded the main landing. But fire from destroyers was too light to seriously affect the defences. A concentrated RAF attack was equally limited in effect. And a smoke screen laid across the headland had dubious value. Indeed, it was a factor contributing to sending in reserves with fatal consequences when the outcome of the original assault was misinterpreted. On the east of the main landing at Puit, just 60 men out of 543 from the Royal Regiment of Canada were taken off. The regiment had been pinned to the beach and destroyed by coastal defence batteries and a well-sighted machine gun. Only a handful of the men of the South Saskatchewan Regiment reached their objectives, with others from this regiment landing in the wrong place. The Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada, despite being landed late, managed to push further inland than any other troops, but were forced back when German reinforcements rushed up. Half an hour after the flank landings, the main assault started. The Canadian Essex Scottish Regiment and Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, supported by 27 Churchill tanks of the 14th Canadian Army Tank Regiment. Most of the tanks lost their tracks as they were driven onto the shingle beach and became crippled targets for German anti-tank guns. Tanks that did cross the shingle were stopped by concrete roadblocks. Without tanks in support, the infantry was simply slaughtered by crossfire from machine guns hidden in the cliffs. Les Fusiliers Mont-Royal, launched straight at the centre of the town, were pinned down under the cliffs. A Royal Marine Commando was ordered to land to support them, a new task which caused chaos. When finally the mess was sorted and the commando moved, many of the craft were hit on the run-in. Those that reached the shore were killed or captured, and their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Tigger Phillips, seeing that the mission was futile, stood up and signalled to those following to turn back. He was killed a few moments later. At 10:20, a little over 5 hours after the battle had begun, 5 hours in which everything possible went wrong, the withdrawal began. 5 hours after that, the last Allied troops had either been taken off, killed, or taken prisoner. 60% of the invading force was killed, wounded, or captured. And they had lost weapons, Dingo armoured cars, and Churchill tanks, which did not impress the Germans. Easy to fight, they said, with a poor and obsolete gun. The Royal Air Force lost over 100 aircraft, the Luftwaffe less than 50, and the Royal Navy lost 33 landing craft and a destroyer. Casualties from the raid included 3,367 Canadians killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, and 275 British commandos. German army casualties were 591. The argument began at once and has not relented. Was the Dieppe Raid of any value?
The principles of special operations are that it's got to be fast, it's got to be stealthy, and you've got to achieve surprise. And this operation was simply too big to achieve that. It was too complex. It couldn't be a special operation in that sense.
They'd certainly been through it, but they were already talking about next time, even before they got into hospital.
It is, of course, easy to make the case that lessons were learned, and that those lessons made a significant difference to planning for the invasion of Europe on D-Day in 1944. It is rather more difficult to make the case that the lessons could not as easily have been learned by better use of intelligence, in both of the meanings of that word.
War in the Pacific has moved so fast that there may be a danger of underrating the enemy. Let no one imagine that recent victories in the Pacific indicate a walkover. The Japanese continue to fight back with a fanaticism quite unknown in the West.
By early 1945, Japan is plainly beaten. On any objective measure, the Japanese Empire cannot win the war. But the Japanese culture, military culture especially, will not allow the Japanese to acknowledge that. So Japan has to be battered into submission. To do that, the Allies, the Americans especially, need to build air bases. To build air bases, they need islands, and if they need islands, they need Okinawa.
For the invasion of Okinawa, 430 assault transports had been loaded at 11 ports from Seattle to Leyte. On April 1st, 1,300 ships were massed offshore, and the first waves of the 155,000 men of General Simon Bolivar Buckner's 10th Army, 3 Marine and 4 Army divisions, began going ashore. They met very little opposition, but before the island fell, American forces involved would have numbered 300,000. General Ushijima, commanding the Japanese 32nd Army, had pulled his forces back, deciding not to contest the landing, but to meet the invasion south of the Shuri Line. By the end of the first day, Buckner had 60,000 men ashore.
General Ushijima's strategy to defend Okinawa is to sell it at the highest human price. So he doesn't waste lives meeting the Americans on the beaches, for example. Japanese withdraw into the interior and they basically say, come and get us. And that means the Americans have to expend lives in order to kill Japanese in order to gain victory. And the Japanese strategy is about the most simple and brutal that you can imagine.
The ships riding at anchor tell a different story. The invasion fleet was battered by the Japanese weapon of last resort, the suicide bomb.
Just minutes after 4 o'clock, it hit the superstructure. Everything went black. We knew we were hit because we were aft, we were machinery aft. Machinery forward was still good.
Over the next few days, the Japanese launched kamikaze assaults on the invasion fleet, which did not wholly relent in all the weeks of fighting that lay ahead.
Here, a Japanese V pilot has ended his career with a direct hit on a carrier of the Essex class. He's caused casualties and damage on board an enemy ship, and it's for just that purpose that his own life was written off from the first day of his training.
By the end of the Okinawa campaign, the suicides of 1,465 kamikaze pilots had accounted for 29 ships sunk, 120 damaged, and 3,048 sailors killed.
It was a kamikaze he took us out. We found his body with a parachute. Couldn't understand why he had a parachute. Because he might have been shot down and he could bail out. What's the answer to that? I would tell you this, and this is hard for me to tell you. He did his job and he did it well.
On the 9th of April, the American invasion force opened its main offensive. 3rd Amphibious Corps General Geiger swung north. As it happens, the northern thrust would meet the least resistance, and the north of the island would fall first. 24th Corps General Hodge landed alongside Geiger's corps and swung south. And here the fighting was hard against an enemy that had sworn to defend every inch to the death. Advancing in parallel along opposite coasts, Geiger's corps reached Cape Hedo at the northern tip of Okinawa in less than 2 weeks, though the Motobu Peninsula was not secured for another week.
By this time, the Americans have been fighting the Japanese for 3 years, and they've been through some appalling battles. They know what the Japanese are capable of, but on Okinawa it gets even worse. And it's probably the worst battle that the Americans fight in the Pacific. I mean, it was the worst ordeal you could imagine. Worse for the Japanese because they killed themselves if they weren't killed by the Americans. But both sides are suffering huge losses.
Heroic dead of a combined Army and Marine force mark the grim battlefield of Okinawa, where one of the bloodiest engagements of the war is being fought. Thousands of Yanks have been wounded, and other thousands have sacrificed their lives to drive a fanatical foe from this vital base, the doorstep to Japan itself.
In the south, it was a different story. The Americans came up against the well-planned fortifications of the Shuri Line and did not breach it and take the island's capital, Naha, until May 27th. Shuri Castle, key to the defensive line, fell on May 29th, with Japanese defenders now falling back for a last stand on the southern tip of the island.
The fight to the last spirit of the Japanese soldier was nowhere more apparent than in the fighting for Okinawa. And it's estimated that out of 108,000 Japs on the island, 101,000 had to be wiped out before victory was achieved. Most of them were blasted out, one by one.
On June the 17th, Japanese morale collapsed. The Japanese started to surrender in numbers. To the surprise of the Americans, who had not known it elsewhere in the Pacific. On June 22nd, General Ushijima committed suicide.
And you can see that they've finally decided that this war's no use. It takes most of the battle before that occurs, and that's a sign of just how tough it's going to be to defeat the Japanese.
Casualty lists were catastrophic. Japanese casualties exceeded 110,000. America's 40,000 in battle and nearly 10,000 more to kamikaze.
Okinawa's not where the Pacific War finishes, because the Americans and the British and the entire Western Allies know that they've got to defeat the Japanese home islands. So one of the most important consequences of Okinawa is that it feeds into the American planning for what is proposed to be the invasion of Japan. And it tells the Americans that they'll not only kill lots and lots of Japanese troops and civilians, but they'll lose perhaps 1 million troops of their own.
That figure weighed heavily in the debate that would resolve the next phase of the war, the use of a new weapon.
So in a sense, Okinawa shapes the history of conflict in the second half of the 20th century.